Possessed by a Dark Warrior, Eternal Mate's Paranormal Romance Series, Book 9, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 1. Blue landed without a sound in the middle of the dense crowd, the vapors from the short teleport shimmering around him for a second before he kicked off, leaving them in his wake as he broke through the throng. His steady gaze locked on his target, focused there even as he felt his 6 men appear a short distance behind him and begin to pursue him. 2 came to flank him, the remaining 4 spreading out through the disgusting gathering of creatures like black tendrils, taking down any who dared to stand in their way. He would have killed them all if he had the choice, but his mission was clear. Retrieve the 2 elf females with minimal fuss. Gods, he would give anything to sink his fangs and his blade into many of the wretched bastards present at the black market auction, a suitable punishment for their despicable behavior, trading in flesh and lives. He snarled, baring his fangs at a fool who rushed into his path in his blind panic, and swept his hand over the length of his black sword, commanding it to transform into his preferred double-ended spear. He swept the curved blade at the end before him upwards, slicing across the side of the male as he turned red eyes on him. Vampire. Blue bit out a nasty curse and gave himself a split second off the mission that had been his sole focus for the past 3 weeks, all the time it took to spin on his heel, bringing his spear around in a deadly black arc to relieve the vampire of his head. The male toppled onto the black ground, some members of the crowd shrieking as they leaped away from the pool of blood cascading from his neck. Blue would have paused to spit on the foul abomination, a disgusting shadow of his own noble species, had his second-in-command not taken the lead at that moment, shouting orders at the other elves and propelling him back into action. Darkness dropped like a veil, and the panic in the arena increased, the crowd growing frenzied as they tried to make off with their sick prizes, scurrying away from the scene of their crimes. A chill swept through the oval canyon, and Blue sensed magic, a powerful enchantment that warned he wasn't alone in desiring to rescue one of the poor souls being thrown onto the slab and sold as meat by the ringmaster of this terrible circus. He threw a glance off to his right, to the black stage, easily able to see it using his heightened vision. A male. Blue paid him no heed as he raced onto the stage to a shifter female. A hellcat. No wonder there was such a large crowd. The other female on the stage moved so swiftly he couldn't make out anything about her, leaping onto the back of the fallen angel who was responsible for the auction. His heart gave a painful beat as she roared and attacked, a sharp sensation that went through him and gave him pause, causing his step to falter and his breath to still. He swallowed hard and frowned at the odd sensation, hazily aware that he should recognize it, but unable to comprehend why. A male swung into his path, stealing his focus away from the stage, and Blue cut him down with his spear, shoved him aside and sprinted harder, catching up with the rest of his team. The damned bastards who had purchased the elf females as if they were animals had backed them into a corner, tucked against the black rock and the dark wooden stage. If they thought that would stop him from slicing them open from balls to brains, they were fucking wrong. His mood degenerated as he reached them, a darkness as thick as the one that had veiled the world in black descending over him, and he slowed his step until he was stalking towards them, the crowd parting to allow him through, as if all present could sense the dark intent rolling off him, the hunger to deal justice with his blade. Light from the torches around the canyon and on the stage flickered back into life, the sensation of magic weakening as the darkness lifted. His vision responded in an instant, adjusting to the bright light and dulling. He flexed his fingers around the black engraved shaft of his spear and sent a mental command to his skin-tight armor, ordering the small obsidian metal scales to flow over his hands and form his claws over his fingers. His violet eyes locked on the male stood slightly forward from the other 2. The elf females huddled naked behind them, clinging to each other, their fear a palpable thing that drummed in Blue's blood, blackening his mood. Blue signaled with his free hand, slowly raising it, and his 6 elf warriors spread out, encircling the men, giving them nowhere to go. He snarled at them, flashing his fangs. He would deal with them first, and then he would deal with the fallen angel who had orchestrated this market, daring to take two of his kind from their kingdom. The leader foolishly lashed out at one of the warriors on his left, brandishing a sword made of steel. Steel. A pathetic mortal-made weapon for a weak creature. Blue drew down a deep breath, catching the scent of their blood, and wasn't surprised that it matched their weapon. Mortal-made. These three men were from that realm, but in their blood was a hint of Fae, an ancestor that had given them access to this realm. Hell. He curled his lip at the three men and dropped his hand. 6 elf warriors launched at the men, easily overpowering them, and Blue wished he had orders to kill, not contain the fiends. "Thank you, but I have to go." A soft female voice rose above the din, and Blue stilled. "I have to fly." A chill skated over his skin beneath his armor, his eyes slowly widening as he finally comprehended why he had felt such a strange yet familiar sensation on seeing the female on stage attacking the fallen angel. Fly. He spun on his heel to face the stage. A heartbeat of time passed, a split second that felt like an eternity, as he stared up at the female on the stage, taking in the striking violet-to-white eyes that he would never forget as they locked on him. Her lips parted, long lashes falling to shutter those incredible eyes, and his pulse hammered into overdrive as 3 long scars on the left side of his neck tingled. He slowly raised his hand to rest his fingers on his armor over them. He inched his right foot forwards, towards her. She turned in an instant, and he could only watch as she transformed into an enormous violet dragon, tearing stunned gasps from the remaining few people in the arena. She reared onto her hind legs, flashing the white stripe that ran from beneath her jaw, down her throat, and under her ribs, and beat her wings, the white membrane between her purple wing bones stark against the dark sky of hell. His breath left him in a rush as she threw her head back, her long white horns almost touching her neck, and roared, the sound deafening as it echoed across the land. "Wait!" He launched onto the stage in a single leap, unwilling to let her escape him again. She snarled through gleaming white fangs, each as long as his arm, and swept her left paw downwards, delivering a devastating backhand that hit him square in the chest, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him flying across the arena so fast that he didn't have a chance to teleport. His back slammed into the rough black rock, fire searing his bones as his mind scrambled, the pain so intense that he couldn't breathe, couldn't think or feel anything for a second. All the time it took for the dragon to launch into the air, her enormous wings sending gusts of wind at those remaining on the stage, almost knocking them over. He couldn't let her escape him again. He wheezed as he pushed onto his feet and staggered towards her, his ears ringing and vision wobbling. He growled as she took flight and used the last of his strength to call a portal. Green-purple light shimmered over his black armor, and he dropped into the darkness. It dissipated a second later as he landed on the stage where the dragon had been. Blue bit out every curse available to him in his native tongue, his legs wobbling beneath him, barely strong enough to support his weight as pain racked him. He stared at the dragon as she flew into the distance, unable to pursue her in his current condition, forced to watch her as she disappeared into the gloom, slipping through his grasp once more. The world around him dulled, and then light pierced the darkness, colorful and bright, twinkling. Blue let his breath out slowly and inched his eyes open, his vision slowly coming into focus, sharpening the beautiful display of light above him. The delicate small flowers on the tree sparkled like starlight, and he lost himself in watching them. A warm breeze blew across him, causing the long grasses and colorful flowers that surrounded him to bend and dance, and their scent to fill the air with sweetness that sank deep into his soul. Whenever a stronger breeze blew, the blooms on the trees would flutter closed in a wave before opening again, shining brighter than ever. Beautiful. He rested in the grass, encompassed by nature, bathed in her warm and comforting light. His muscles felt liquid beneath his skin, his bones loose, his body filled with a floating sensation, one that he couldn't remember feeling in a long time, but he still knew the name of it. Peace. He lifted a heavy arm and managed to run his fingers through the longer lengths of his blue-black hair, preening it back as he tried to remember the last time he had felt this sedated and relaxed. Long enough that it felt foreign to him now. Centuries, perhaps. Millennia. Gods. Maybe he hadn't experienced it since he had left his home village to join the ranks of the soldiers, swearing to protect his kingdom and his princes. He had been serving one of those princes for 42 centuries, almost his entire life. It had become his whole life. It was his purpose. Had been his purpose. He threw his arm across his eyes and heaved a sigh as he pushed away from that thought and crushed it out of existence by focusing on the nature surrounding him, soothing his weary soul and bringing him a moment of peace that he knew would be all too brief. He switched his focus from the nature around him to the dream once he began to relax again, picking out every detail of what was actually a memory, a moment that had occurred only months ago. He pushed deeper into his memories of the female, running back to another time 3 centuries ago when their paths had crossed in a dragon clan's village. The scars on his neck tingled, luring him into drawing his arm away from his eyes to run his fingers over them. Scars she had given to him. He focused on them and turned the clock back another 4 centuries, to when he had first set eyes on her. She had been in her dragon form, her violet scales dark in contrast to the white of her breast, an invader in the elf kingdom, and one he had been dispatched to pursue and capture and bring to justice for her crimes. She had stolen something precious from Prince Loren, a powerful sword of elven making that had belonged to his father and had been protected in the palace, locked safely away from the world where it could do no harm. In her reckless hunger for the sword, she had rampaged across the elf kingdom, laying waste to many villages, slaying thousands of his kin. He had fought her near the border with the first realm of the demons, where mountains rose high into the darkening sky beyond the elf kingdom, beyond the sphere of the light they brought into their realm to make it verdant and give it life. She had escaped them, but then she had returned a short time later. That time he had led the charge against her, but she had been stronger than he had anticipated, had injured several of his warriors and himself too. They had lost her, and he had hunted for her for decades before he'd had to move his focus to matters regarding his prince's safety. 400 years later, when Prince Loren had sensed the presence of the sword again, linked to it through the blood of his father, Blue had led the 3 finest elf warriors in the army to the dragon realm to seek her out and regain the ancient blade. He squeezed his eyes shut as he recalled crossing paths with a slender female in one of the villages, and she shimmered into being in his mind, as if it had been only yesterday. Her tightly pulled back hair accentuated her striking sculpted features, her face bathed in the shadows of the small thatched stone building she had exited. He had questioned her, so entranced by her beauty and how she kept her head bowed, a touch of shyness to her behavior, that he had allowed his men to leave his side to question others. A foolish mistake. He had dropped his guard and she had lunged at him when he had pressed her about the violet and white dragon, her talons raking down his throat and her incredible eyes flashing dangerously at him as she came into the light. It had taken him a moment to realize she was the dragon he hunted, long enough that she had fled before he could stop her, transforming and flying away from him just as she had in the arena only a few months ago. Blue stroked the scars on his neck, the proof of her sin and a constant reminder of his unfulfilled mission. She had slaughtered thousands of his kin, had stolen something precious to his prince, and extremely dangerous. With such a weapon, she could slay an entire legion of elves with one swing. Now that she had surfaced again, he wasn't going to let her escape him. This time, he would capture her and bring her to justice. The flowers above him in the trees twinkled, their warm light flowing over him, soothing the fatigue from his body. He had been tracking her for what felt like forever, but he wasn't sure how long he had been gone from the elf kingdom. Not more than 7 days, perhaps 10 at most. Time had lost meaning in his pursuit of her, his mind so focused on his mission and following all the leads he had to their conclusion, or to the next lead that drove him ever onwards, inching closer to her. He would complete this mission. He had never failed one, wasn't the sort of male who could leave things unfinished. He always had to see them through to the end, even when that end was one that hurt him. He couldn't leave a fight, could never surrender, not even when his life was at stake. He would finish this. Blue rose fluidly onto his feet and stretched, clasping his hands together above his head. His fingers brushed the flowers on the trees, causing the blooms to briefly close and the light to dip before they reopened and glowed brighter. The grass tickled his calves as it sprang back and wavered in the warm breeze. Nature cocooned him in a brief, sweet embrace that he savored, aware that it would be a while before he could visit this place again. He tipped his head back and brushed his fingertips across the deep green leaves of the tree that had given him shelter, silently thanking nature for her comfort and for restoring his body, driving the weariness from it enough that he could continue. He stalked forwards, his bare feet lightly compressing the grasses as he walked through them, heading towards the edge of the forest. With a simple mental command, his armor flowed from the black and silver bands around his wrists, the scales rippling over his body to cover his nudity. Boots formed over his feet first, and then the scales raced upwards, over his calves and thighs, cupping his backside and groin, before encasing his stomach and chest and running down his arms. He kept his hands unprotected and ran his fingers over the scars on the left side of his throat again, his thoughts locked on the dragon female as he strode out of the forest. The warm light of nature gave way to the darkness of the fifth realm of the demons, the calming soft touch slipping from him and leaving him cold inside. Black gravel crunched beneath his boots as he marched up the incline, heading into the gloom, his eyes rapidly adjusting to the grim realm, sharpening to pick out the subtle difference between the bare obsidian lands and the deep gray sky of hell. Blue halted at the brow of the slope, standing at the precipice where the black land plummeted into a deep canyon. He scoured the lands beyond the canyon, the third realm of demons. Beyond that was the mountainous home of her kind, dragons. If his information was correct, he would find his next lead there. He called his black blade to his left hand and narrowed his eyes on the deep distance, all of his focus on it. He was closing in on her. 700 years of hunting were finally going to end. Chapter 2. Taryn skirted the border of the village, remaining as far from it as possible as she hurried across the hilly terrain. She kept her head down, a tattered swath of black cloth she had picked up gods only knew where or how long ago, covering it to conceal her hair and her face. Her heart drummed a sickening rhythm behind her breast, and the thick roll of cloth she carried on her back, the leather strap attached to it tight across her left shoulder and breasts and around her right ribs, felt heavy today. Heavier than yesterday, which had felt heavier than the day before. The closer she drew to the edge of the dragon realm, the heavier her burden grew. She tensed as a dragon flew overhead, going still and hoping her black leather trousers, boots, and top, and the cloth over her head would camouflage her against the obsidian land. The drumming of her heart grew fiercer, and she struggled to breathe as she waited for the dragon to move on, reaching the edge of her senses. Her gaze flicked in that direction, and she watched the great green beast land in the village in the distance. God, she needed to fly. That need surged through her, and she was close to shifting when she caught herself, and the cold reminder of what would happen if she took on her dragon form slithered through her. The dragons would see her. Her cover would be blown, and she would probably come under attack from her own kin. Not only that, but this close to the edge of the realm, near the mountains that bordered it, there was a chance that he would sense her from where he waited beyond the cragged peaks. On the other side of the treacherous black range was a valley, a realm that few dragons dared to cross into, and that many whispered dark and gruesome tales about. The Valley of the Dark Edge, her final destination. He waited there, for her cargo. Taryn trudged onwards, her feet sore from walking and heart aching with a need to shift and take flight, to shed the tethers of her mortal form and fly free. She needed to fly. Instead of surrendering to that powerful urge, she wrapped her arms around herself and marched forwards, her eyes locked on the peaks that stood between her and her destination. Between her and her twin brother, Tenak was waiting for her. She had kept him waiting long enough. The road was little more than a winding, narrow path that soon gave way to only rock as it led her upwards into the foothills of the mountains. She moved her focus to her feet, picking a route over the treacherous and steep terrain. Rock shifted underfoot, bouncing down the side of the mountain, tumbling into the valley. She lost track of time as she walked, weary and sore, the ache to fly growing stronger as her instincts roared that she could reach the other side of the mountain range in no more than a few beats of her wings if she shifted. The temptation was great, but the instinct that warned Tenak would sense her if she shifted kept it tempered, stopping her from giving in to it. She removed the cloth from her head when the nearest village was nothing more than a speck on the horizon, and the dragons remained at a distance. Afraid of the mountains because of the male who lurked beyond them. She blew out her breath and combed her fingers through her shoulder-length hair, untangling it from the violet roots to its white tips. They were dirty, dull with grit from the journey, and she couldn't remember the last time she had bathed. The fantasy of a warm bath kept her mind occupied as she soldiered onwards, clambering over boulders and edging around rocks that blocked her path. She pressed her back to one as she shuffled around it, her eyes on her feet on the narrow ledge and the several hundred-foot drop below. If she fell, she would have to shift to save herself. Her pulse pounded at the thought, and she breathed deep to steady it, reassuring herself that she wouldn't fall. She reached the edge of the ledge and safety, and scrambled up over another rock. As she hit the top of it, she paused, the black rock biting into her knees through her trousers and her palms, and looked back in the direction she had come. The whole world stretched before her, endless peaks that were home to her kin, harboring almost 100 clan villages within their valleys. Home. It had been her home once, centuries ago, before her brother had stolen it from her. She turned her head in the other direction, seeing down into the valley beyond the mountain she climbed, and to the ones that surrounded it, larger and more formidable than any ranges in the dragon realm. A red haze clung to the bases of many of the mountains in the distance, as if flames filled their valleys, and fiery veins streaked the ones off to her right, ominous cracks and booms echoing from them. The Devil's Domain. Taryn lowered her violet-to-white gaze to the valley below her, nestled between the Devil's Domain and the Dragon's Realm. It belonged to neither, a no-man's land that had once been the realm of the hell beasts and other fell creatures. It was now Tenak's kingdom. He had claimed it through blood and fire, slaughtering all who dared to stray into it. Her blood chilled and she shifted onto her backside, shimmied to the edge of the rock and carefully started down the other side of the mountain, ignoring the instinct that whispered at her to turn back. She couldn't. She knew what she was doing might be the end of her, but she would accept that, as long as it was the end of her brother, too. She had neglected her duty for too long, and she had to finish it now, before Tenak turned his wicked gaze back on the Dragon Realm and the other kingdoms of hell, bent on bringing them all to their knees so he might rule them. The rock was sharp underfoot, slicing into the soles of her boots, as if the valley had teeth and wanted to take a bite out of her. She lifted her right foot to rub it and give it some relief, and her left one slipped. She bit down on her tongue to stop herself from shrieking as she skidded down the side of the mountain, afraid that she would draw attention to herself. The scent of blood surrounded her, the hot stab of each rock burning in her palms as she groped for a hold, and her teeth cut into her tongue when her fingers caught on a crack in the mountain, and she jerked to a halt. She lay there for some time, breathing hard, struggling to steady her heart. Her entire body shook, teeth clattering as adrenaline and fear refused to ebb away, combining to strip her strength. When she finally calmed, she pulled herself up onto her knees, found a small ledge where she could rest, and scanned the mountainside. She had pushed herself too hard, had walked too far, and had almost paid the price. If she had shifted to save herself, or cried out, there was every chance her brother would have sensed her presence and come to her, and she wasn't ready to face him yet. The quiet voice at the back of her mind asked whether she would ever be ready. She had been putting this off for 2 lunar cycles already, coming up with excuses to avoid making the journey to the valley and facing her brother. Her gaze stopped on a ledge with a dark recess just 100 feet below to her left. She would rest there, gather her strength, and then she would continue her journey. She wouldn't turn back. She wouldn't give up. She would keep marching forwards and stick to her plan. Taryn edged down the steep slope on her backside, slipping at times, slowly making her way towards the ledge. She breathed a sigh as she crawled onto it and saw that the recess was larger than she had expected, forming a small cave. The rock wrapped around her as she entered it, comforting her as it spoke to her dragon instincts. Many of her kind lived in caves, preferring their ancient habitat to the newer ideal of living in villages. She was old enough to appreciate a cave, to feel soothed by cool rocks surrounding her. She stopped near the entrance and looked down into the valley, scanning it for any signs of life. Nothing. She scoured the mountains that surrounded the valley and frowned at the far end of it, squinting as she tried to make out the range there. She swore there was a structure built against the mountain rising out of it. A castle? Was her brother there? She moved to the wall of the cave, sat on her backside with her legs crossed, and unfastened the leather strap that cut diagonally across her chest. She removed the thick roll of black cloth from her back and settled it beside her, placing her hand on it and feeling the power vibrating through her palm. Her cargo resembled nothing more than a rolled blanket for sleeping on, fastened with 2 leather straps at either end. But it was something precious, extremely precious to Tenak, to others too. She lifted her hand and touched the thick leather straps that circled her wrists too, feeling the power in those, the same as was in the straps on her cargo. She rubbed her thumb over the hell beast hide, feeling the symbols carved into the dark brown leather. Magic. It concealed the contents of the blanket, and her presence too. If she removed either the straps on the blanket or the cuffs around her wrist, her brother would sense their presence and come, wild with a need to reclaim what he viewed as his property, both the sword and her. Taryn closed her eyes and leaned back into the wall, seeking the peace of sleep. It refused to come, her mind throwing images of her journey at her, of battling hell beasts and avoiding her dragon kin. She had wanted to speak with them so many times, but fear they would blame her for her brother's crimes had forced her to keep her distance. Perhaps she should have remained with Loki, a dragon male who was like another brother to her, but she had feared she would bring their kin's wrath down upon him too, and she loved him too dearly to place him in such danger. Danger. She shuddered, a sudden cold sweeping through her when she thought about the danger she might be in, was in. Loki had witnessed a vision of her, a gift born of his more powerful dragon blood, and it had been on her mind since she had collected the sword from him and had left his cave. She couldn't help feeling that she was marching towards her death, just as he had seen. It was part of the reason she had taken so long to finally set out on her journey to face her brother. She was afraid, bone-deep afraid. She had been through hell the past 3 centuries, passed between owners as if she was nothing more than a beast, a piece of meat they could attempt to break and drag down into a depraved world where she would think only of pleasing her master. Even though she had endured a life that would have caused many to take their own, she didn't want to die. Taryn lowered her gaze to the wrapped sword beside her and rested her hand on the blanket that covered it again, feeling its power resonate through her palm. The sword was all her brother thought about. It was all he desired. She was risking her life by bringing it here, and by returning to Tenak. If he didn't kill her on the spot when she revealed herself to him, he might only be luring her into a trap to kill later. And what if she failed? What if he took the sword and she couldn't stop him? She would have delivered the whole of hell into his hands. Gods, she was a fool. She knew she should take the sword and turn back before he could sense her, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had sworn to stop her brother 7 centuries ago, when she had discovered his plan to steal the sword from the elf kingdom, because he viewed the sword as belonging to him, not the elves. It was forged of the blood of their grandfather, one of the strongest dragons to have lived in ancient times when an elven king had ruled in the mortal realm, and her ancestors had been free to fly there. That elven king had captured her grandfather and bled him, pouring his life force into the metal of the blade, and mixing it with a single drop of his own blood. The blade was power, The strongest of the elven metals and the strongest blood forged into a single weapon that gave the wielder control over ancient magic contained in the blade. It could cut through any armor or weapon, but its true power was the ability to condense the magic it contained into an arc of pure light that could cut through an enemy horde with one swing. Taryn had tried to stop him from stealing the sword, but she had failed. He had taken the blade, but she hadn't given up, and in the end she had managed to steal the blade from him before he could use it. Now it was her bait. It was her way of regaining her brother's trust and stopping him from killing her as payment for her betrayal. She was determined to end everything, and she had little time to carry out her plan. She had delayed too long, afraid of facing her brother, afraid of facing a world without him. This was her responsibility, though, her duty, and she had to be the one to carry it out. Because a life in slavery had more appeal, had been better than a life lived in fear of her brother. If she didn't go to him, he would eventually come to her, would leave a path of destruction in his wake as he scoured the realms for her. She had heard the stories. Every few years he ventured out from his valley, razing lands and slaughtering thousands as he hunted for her and the sword. She had that blood on her hands, but she wouldn't bear any more. She would end it. She would use her life in slavery, the one she was trying to leave behind, the memories she wanted to purge, to win Tenak's trust, pretending that the 3 centuries of torture she had endured had driven her mad with a need for vengeance, filling her with a thirst to rain dark terror down on all the realms. Taryn shuddered and curled up, pulling her knees to her chest. She rocked slowly, her eyes locked on the wall across from her, not seeing it as she battled the memories that surged to the surface. She focused on Loki, picturing his face, his bright aquamarine eyes that had shown a wealth of concern when he had handed over the sword and told her of the vision, told her of the terrible things her brother had done. Tenak had grown mad with a hunger for violence, bloodshed, and death. It was that madness that had gripped him that she was going to use to her advantage, making him believe they were infected with the same terrible disease of the mind, and they were kindred spirits once more. Her plan was flawless, but she still couldn't stop the doubts from creeping in and taking hold of her. She had tried to shake them, but in the end she had realized that nothing she did would silence them, and she had set off on her journey with them echoing in her mind. Maybe she should have left the sword with Loki. Her brother was stronger than she was, both in dragon and mortal form. He had killed anyone who had strayed into his kingdom. What made her think that she wouldn't suffer the same fate? She was his blood, his twin, his other half. She knew she could make him recognize her, because she had done so in the past. He'd had spells of madness before, back in the days before he had grown obsessed with setting himself up as the ruler of hell and stealing the sword from the elves to make that happen. She had brought him back to her then, and she could do it again. She had to be strong and believe in what he had once told her, that he would never hurt her. He never had. Even in his darkest rages, he had never raised a claw against her. If anyone could get close enough to him to end him, it was her. She had to try. If she failed, she wouldn't be alive to see the horror he would unleash on hell anyway. He would surely kill her. Taryn shoved away from that grim thought and refocused on the wall, breathing steadily to center her mind and steady her heart and her nerves. She steered her mind towards calmer waters, to thoughts that would soothe her so she could sleep well and gain the rest she needed. Her head and heart filled with images from better days long past, of her brother and Loki. It had felt good to see Loki again after their centuries apart. He was the only person in hell she was close to now, the only one she trusted. He meant the world to her, was the brother that Tenak had once been, a very long time ago. Loki had taken care of her for thousands of years, over half of her life, after Tenak had grown distant and obsessed with power. It was still difficult to think of the things her brother had done in her absence and believe they were true. The male she had grown up with had been gentle, tender, and affectionate. How had he grown into one who would lead a legion of dragons to their deaths, promising them power and wealth, and then using them as shields on the battlefield? sending them out first so he could weaken the enemy before claiming victory himself. Her dearest brother. She loved him, but since escaping the slavers and learning of the things he had done, she was beginning to wonder whether she only felt that emotion because it was what she should feel for him as her twin. Was she blinded by their bond? She had truly loved him once, with all of her heart, but she couldn't condone his plans or the things he had done in their centuries apart, slaughtering masses of demons and fae, and even his own beloved kin. Taryn closed her eyes and settled her chin on her knees, hugging her legs closer to her chest. Her heart felt heavy behind her breast, weighted with the sins of her brother and her responsibility as his sister, and the black future that awaited her if she succeeded in her mission. A world without him. A life alone. Tears burned hot behind her eyes, but she refused them, drawing a deep breath to hold them at bay and blowing it out as she sought calm. She pushed away from her somber thoughts, not wanting to think about it any more tonight. She just wanted to close her eyes, leave her worries behind for a few short hours, and hopefully she would feel stronger come the morning. The comforting arms of sleep drifted around her, and he was there waiting for her. Sinful, wicked, beautiful. The elf. His sinful smile was in place, those violet eyes shimmering with wicked allure as he gazed at her, casting black magic on her that had her falling ever deeper under his spell. Taryn shoved away from sleep, forcing herself awake again, afraid of dreaming of the male she knew pursued her, hunted her. He was always one step behind her in this waking world, but forever one step ahead in the dream one, waiting for her to succumb to the lure of sleep and fall back into his arms. Those strong arms would wrap around her, filling her mind with ridiculous hopes as he drew her against him. Each dream only strengthened her dragon instincts, making her ache with a need to possess him, to sink her claws into the beautiful male and make him belong to her, her finest treasure. Taryn fought the lure of sleep, the lure of the elf male, but he was too powerful, casting an enchantment over her and drawing her back to him. She was too tired to push him away this time and fell easily into the dream, right into his arms, craving the comfort of him even when she feared he would be the one to kill her, just as Loki had seen in his vision. The dark elf male feathered his fingers across her cheek, the touch so light she shivered from it, and slipped them beneath her chin. He tilted her head up, his violet gaze turning hooded as it dropped to her mouth, filled with delicious intent. She didn't resist him, didn't have the strength to deny him this time. She welcomed the kiss, the tantalizing brush of his firm lips across hers that stirred the heat in her veins into an inferno, and made her burn for him in her dream, and ache for him in reality. Hungry for a taste of him, her dark warrior. Chapter 3. The mountains seemed endless, stretching as far as his eyes could see across 180 degrees of his field of vision. Blue stood high on a cragged ledge, his back to a black mountain that many in hell would find forbidding, because it marked the border of the dragon realm. He could see a few flying into the realm, their jewel colors bright against the dull gray sky. He hadn't lived in the time when dragons had been free to fly in the mortal realm, but he could easily imagine how majestic they would have appeared against a dazzling blue backdrop spotted with pale clouds. Dragons had been allies of the elves once, so many millennia ago that the only proof they had of their friendship were tattered pieces of the ancient records of the elven kings and queens, scratched onto thick leather now so brittle they would break if someone dared to remove them from the delicate glass case that contained them in the castle. The castle. Blue turned his gaze towards it, instinctively aware of which direction his home lay in, feeling the familiar tug in his gut that told him to return to it. He had business there, and he had never been one to ignore his instincts. They were rarely wrong, and right now they were blaring a warning at him to step back from the dragon realm and seek a safer course of action. He needed a team if he was going to venture into the realm of dragons and dare to question them about one of their own kind. It was too dangerous to head in alone. Dragons were fiercely protective of their own kind, even those they knew had committed a crime that had given their species a black name in the language of the elves. He didn't fancy ending up as roasted elf, so he would return to the castle and form his team, the same trio of warriors that had been with him the last time he had hunted the female dragon. He focused on his body, calling his portal, and green-purple light shimmered over the scales of his black armor. Darkness swallowed him, and when it receded, he was standing in the bright sun-filled verdant courtyard of the castle. It towered above him, a beautiful mixture of pale and dark stone quarried from the mountains, shaped to form tall towers topped with conical tiled roofs, set on a series of large square buildings with balconies that ran across their length. The main building stood 5 stories tall, and the thick towers rose to spear the darkening sky and added another 6 levels. A warm breeze chased over the high walls surrounding the castle and rustled the leaves of the trees in the orchard around him, carrying the scent of their blooms. Nature embraced him again, a tender touch that soothed him after being surrounded by the darkness of the demon and dragon realms. He began to relax and then tensed again when Prince Loren appeared right in front of him, his handsome face dark and his violet eyes flashing as he shoved his fingers through his neat blue-black hair and began to pace. His formal knee-length jacket flapped around his legs with each agitated stride across the pale gravel path that spread outwards from the portal, intersecting the lush grass that grew beneath the trees. Something was wrong. Wrong enough that his prince had left a council meeting to come straight to him. Before he could ask his prince what was bothering him, Loren turned on him. The dark crescents beneath his prince's eyes concerned him, and he took a step forwards, growing determined to find out what was worrying him and find a way to relieve his prince of whatever burden his shoulders held. "Where have you been?" Loren said, a slight somber edge to his voice as he halted before Blue, his bright violet eyes searching Blue's. "You have failed to return to the castle since Vale came." There was a tone in those last 3 words that conveyed a wealth of hurt but relief, too. Loren always sounded that way when speaking of his younger brother, but Blue held no love for the Mad Prince himself, not since he had gone to war with Loren and the Elf Kingdom, and had decimated an entire legion of the army. The legion Blue had served in under Vale. He had been one of only a handful of survivors. He wasn't sure he would ever be able to think well of Vale, not even after everything they had learned about the reasons he had attacked his own kind. The things he had seen Vale do were branded on his mind, seared on his soul, together with the deep pain he had caused Loren. Blue couldn't forgive him. "It has been a lunar cycle, so I will ask again. Where have you been, Blue?" A month? He could only stare at Loren as that sank in. He had thought it had been a week at most since he had left the castle, intent on returning to the last place he had seen the dragon female and seeing if he could uncover any clues that might lead him to her. A month. "Did your disappearance and subsequent avoidance of your home have anything to do with Vale, because he is left with Rosalind?" There was a softer note to his prince's voice now, a soothing one that had no effect on Blue, as it dawned on him that his leaving had in part been because of Vale's sudden appearance, but not because he despised Loren's brother. He rolled his shoulder in a casual shrug, trying to let the epiphany roll off him just as easily, but failing dismally. His mood blackened again, just as it had that night a month ago when he had learned another fool had fallen under the spell of a bond. A male no one in their right mind could love had found someone who loved him, and fuck had it stung. "Good for him," Blue muttered and turned to walk away. "Answer me, Blue," Loren barked, and he halted, freezing to the spot and aware of the danger he was in. Loren rarely raised his voice, especially to him. When he did, he meant business, and right now his prince was throwing off vibes that warned he was liable to break with convention and throw him in the cells if he was disobedient. It would be a first. Blue had mouthed off to him, had behaved with little respect at times, and never had his prince punished him. Blue slowly turned back to face him. "Did you stay away because of Vale?" Loren whispered, a heartfelt plea for an answer that told Blue his prince didn't want to punish him this time either. But people were watching them closely, and they would expect Lauren to do just that if Blue showed an ounce of disrespect. He shook his head. "No, Vale isn't the reason I've been away from the castle." It was the truth. Well, mostly the truth. Vale wasn't the whole reason he had left or the reason why he had been away. He had just been the last straw. Seeing Vale bonded to his fated female on a day that had been Lauren's wedding day to his own mate Olivia, and had brought the happily mated couples of Sable and Thorn, and Blue's sister Iolanthe and her mate Kiter to the Elf Kingdom, had hit Blue hard. He hadn't really thought about his actions at the time. He hadn't really considered why he had left or what he had been feeling. He'd had a pressing need to investigate the dragon, and he had left to do just that. But an entire month had passed, and the look in Lauren's eyes told him that he had worried him, that the tone Blue had heard in his voice and the somber edge to his eyes had nothing to do with Vale and everything to do with him, and that Lauren wanted answers now. Blue had none to give him, at least none that answered the questions in Lauren's eyes, because he didn't want to look too closely at his reasons for leaving. Instead, he would give his prince a safer explanation for his behavior. "I tracked the dragon," he said, and Lauren's expression gained a curious edge, and he stepped closer to Blue. Blue sighed and raked his fingers over his longer hair, preening it back from his face as he tried to figure out where to begin. He knew how important the sword was to Lauren, and he had sworn to retrieve it, and now he felt he was on the verge of fulfilling that promise. "I believe she has returned to her own realm for some reason. Perhaps the dragons there are hiding her, or she has gone to see someone, or she believes she will be able to conceal herself again among her own kind. I only returned to assemble a team so I might track the dragon into her own realm." Lauren began pacing again, his head bent and the thumb of his left hand playing on his lip. His prince had never been able to keep still when thinking. It drove the Council of Elders mad when he silently paced back and forth in front of his throne, and that often amused Blue no end. Anything that pissed off the council was fantastic in his opinion. They were antiquated idiots who stuck firmly to the rules and had given his prince nothing but pain and heartache for the 42 centuries he had been at war with Vale, constantly badgering him to kill his brother. Blue had been all for killing Vale, but he never had been able to bring himself to do it whenever they fought. He had always faltered when dealing the killing blow, aware of the devastating pain it would cause Lauren if he took Vale's life. Now the council were probably giving Lauren hell as he attempted to convince them to allow Vale back into the Elf Kingdom now that he had proven he had been nothing but a pawn, a puppet controlled by a dark witch, and was maddened by the terrible things he had done. Blue couldn't see them agreeing to that, and he couldn't see his prince giving up this time either. Lauren was a stubborn bastard at times, especially where those he loved were concerned. "I have experienced fleeting sensations." Lauren glanced across at him but didn't slow his pacing, taking long strides across the path, only needing 3 to reach the grass before he had to turn back around. His prince needed a bigger space to work off some of his tension. Blue would have offered to spar with him, but the urge to pull his team together and head into the dragon realm was growing stronger, and the thought of delaying his departure was near painful. He had to get back to the dragon realm. He had to find her. "They are familiar, and it took me some time, but I have realized what they are. It is the sword." Lauren huffed, and his lips twisted into a grim, self-reproaching smile. "I admit that it has taken me some time to decipher the sensation, because my connection to it is not as strong as Vale's. But it has surfaced again. Perhaps the dragon has retrieved it from wherever she hid it." Blue didn't like the sound of that. They still didn't know why the dragon had stolen it, or whether she had any ill intentions. She could easily decimate an entire demon army with it. But if that had been her agenda, why would she have waited so long to carry it out? Why had she hidden the sword? He wanted to believe that she viewed the sword as treasure and only treasure, but there was still a part of him that feared she meant to use it, that she had been waiting for some reason. Dragons could see the future if they were born of a strong bloodline. Had she seen something in her future and had stolen the sword because of it, and had been waiting all this time for that future to come to pass? Lauren's hand clapped down on Blue's shoulder, jerking him away from thoughts of the dragon and what might lie ahead. "Hunt the dragon. Eliminate her. Retrieve that sword for me, Blue." Blue had the feeling his prince was more aware of his innermost feelings, the ones he had tried to bury deep and ignore, than he would like, and was giving him a mission to focus on in order to take his mind off things, to give him a purpose again. "The dragon we met in the mortal realm, Loki, had no information for me when I spoke with him." Lauren's expression turned troubled again, and he worried his lip with his thumb, the black slashes of his eyebrows drawing down. Blue suspected the dragon knew more than he had admitted to Lauren. He wanted to speak with the one called Loki, but Lauren had agreed to leave him alone if he gave them whatever information he had. That only deepened Blue's suspicion of him. If the male knew nothing, why had he pressed Lauren to promise to never approach him again? Lauren sighed, and Blue caught the wary edge to his eyes as they slid his way, sensed the tension in him increase before he opened his mouth to speak. "It might be best we speak with Vale," his prince said, and Blue could see why his mood had shifted. Lauren wanted to be the one to go, but he couldn't, so he was going to dump the task on Blue's shoulders, even though he knew how little Blue liked his brother. He was entrusting him with the task, though, and Blue wouldn't fail him. No matter how little he liked his new mission, he would carry it out to the best of his abilities for his prince. He would set aside his personal feelings about Vale for long enough to speak with him about the sword. If Lauren was right and Vale had a stronger connection to it, the elf might be able to help him locate it, cutting down the amount of time it would take him to find it. Lauren tilted his head back, another sigh escaping him as he stared up at the sky. Blue could sense his desire to leave the elf kingdom and speak with his brother, but it would be a dangerous move. Lauren had clashed with the council too many times since they had discovered Vale had been placed under a spell, controlled by a witch and forced to do her bidding. He couldn't push them right now. It was bad enough that he had obviously ditched a meeting with them to speak with Blue the second he had returned to the castle. It didn't exactly make him feel great either. His gut squirmed, churning from the thought that he had worried his prince enough that he had risked angering the council in order to see him. Lauren needed to restore some of the peace between him and the council, not upset them further. He needed to remain at the castle with them, attending to his business as the ruler of the kingdom, placating the council. If it would help Lauren achieve that peace with the council, Blue would stomach visiting Vale in his stead. "I will go," Blue said, a bitter taste coating his tongue as he thought about seeing Vale again. Not only Vale, Rosalind would be there too. Happily mated. He shoved those two words away, ignoring them and the sting they caused behind his breast, and focused on Lauren. His prince still looked troubled, his crystal violet eyes locked with his and flooded with concern. He squeezed Blue's shoulder, and the corners of his lips tilted in a half-smile. "Be gentle with Vale." Blue huffed, his mood souring again. He was perfectly capable of playing nice with Vale long enough to get whatever information the mad bastard could give to him. Lauren's smile grew. "I know that look, Blue. Give me your word." It was degrading to have to do it, but he had long ago decided he would do anything for Lauren, even talk with Vale. "I swear I will be nice to him." Blue shrugged free of Lauren's grip, his mood darkening further as he spotted a slender brunette female hurrying towards them from the castle, her pale blue skirts drawn up and away from her feet. Fantastic. It was time he left. He bowed his head to Lauren. "I will report what I discover." Before he could turn away, Olivia reached Lauren. Her arm immediately looped around his right one, and Lauren looked down at her. Her smile for her mate was dazzling, near blinding, and Blue looked away as she tried to turn that happiness in his direction. "I'm so glad you're back. Lauren was worried sick." Olivia's words struck hard, each one driving a spike deeper into his heart. He didn't need her adding to the guilt he already felt, and he certainly didn't have time to stand around and watch as Lauren gazed at her, an altogether too soft look on his face, as if his mate was a damned angel descended from heaven straight into hell. But he couldn't pull himself away or stop himself from looking at them as they smiled at each other, sickeningly in love. He couldn't stop himself from thinking about the others. Iolanthe had Kiter, Sable had chosen Thorn. Someone had even been insane enough to fall in love with Vale. He growled under his breath before he could think the next thought, the one he could feel coming, one he didn't want to acknowledge. He didn't need a mate. He didn't need anyone. He just needed to keep hunting the dragon. He stiffly bowed his head, turned on his heel, and stalked away from them, his focus locking onto his mission once more. He ignored the words of hurt Olivia spoke to Lauren and just kept walking, heading towards the grand archway in the wall, his pace gaining speed. The garrison came into view as he passed under the archway, an imposing pale 3-story square building off to his right. Horses whinnied in the stable as they were groomed, tended to by the youngest soldiers. He bowed his head to the ranking officers that he passed, exchanging silent greetings with them. As commander of the Legion directly under Lauren's control, he held a rank above all of the males present, but he had never elevated himself to such a position. He didn't demand respect from his subordinates, or treat them as inferior as some of the commanders of the other legions did. He preferred to work alongside his men, as an equal. Blue halted and backtracked as one of the males he had come to see walked out of the stable block, dusting down his black trousers, the wood and leather soles of his boots a steady click on the cobbles. Leif. The bastard looked more like Lauren every day. Sometimes Blue swore he emulated their prince. Other times he decided it was just genetics. Leif was born of noble blood, had an irritating regal bearing and aloof tone of voice bred into him. Leif's steps slowed and his purple eyes drifted towards Blue, his fine black eyebrows dipping as his lips compressed. Leif was rarely pleased to see him, too. He blamed Blue for losing the female dragon 3 centuries ago. Believed Blue should have been less concerned with bleeding to death from the brutal claw mark she had placed on his throat, and more concerned about grabbing hold of her before she could run. Blue couldn't hold it against him. He would have felt the same had Leif been the one in his shoes, placing his life above the mission. They shared a compulsion to complete missions, and he was banking on that drive still being there, making Leif want to take up the hunt for the dragon again.
There is only one possible reason you have shown your face now, and if it has anything to do with the rumors going around the garrison about a shady black market arena and our dearest commander being launched across it by a female dragon, then you can count me in.
Leif snarled each word as he stalked towards Blue, darkness rolling off him, hunger to continue their mission.
You took your damned time returning, though. Dacian has been putting poor foolish soldiers into sickbay for the past 3 lunar cycles.
That was a nice way of saying that Dacian was taking out his frustration and impatience on the soldiers he was meant to be training in the ring. Blue sighed. The big elf warrior had never learned to express his emotions in other ways, always preferring to unleash them in the ring in the form of fighting.
I suppose he is there now.
Blue was already heading in the direction of the open stretch of sand behind the stables before Leif could answer. The male fell into step with him, and Blue almost felt as if it was Lauren there. Same 6'5" height and slender build, same neatly clipped blue-black hair and ridiculously noble profile. Leif lacked something, though, a sense of humor. Even Lauren had one of those. But where Leif lacked it, the 4th member of their troop had it in spades. Finn's raucous laughter reached Blue's ears long before he had finished traversing the narrow cobbled alley between the stable block and garrison. He rounded the corner and found the young elf male sitting on top of the low dark stone wall that enclosed the training area, rocking back on it but somehow maintaining his balance as he laughed his backside off at something. His long ponytail swayed with his movements, brushing across his bare back, reaching the small of it. Blue peered into the sand-filled ring and grimaced. Dacian lay on his back, sand pushed up around his bare, broad shoulders, his naked feet resting in a groove in the amber dirt. Blue followed that track to the one who had laid one of their biggest, most brutal warriors out cold. No wonder Finn had been laughing. The young female elf breathed hard, one hand still tucked defensively against her chest, and the other still outstretched, her palm facing Dacian. Blue clapped slowly. Finn stopped laughing and snapped his head towards Blue. The female blushed a deep shade of red. She was pretty, as vicious as Blue remembered, too. He bet that the sparring match had been Finn's idea. Dacian hadn't been there the time Finn's sister had come to visit, so he hadn't witnessed that she had some of the strongest telekinesis Blue had ever seen, her gift a natural one from the gods. She had begged Blue and Leif to train her, but females weren't allowed in the ranks, a tradition still firmly in place today. Blue had trained his own sister in secret, passing on everything he had learned so she could fight and defend herself. That knowledge had probably saved her life countless times. By the look of things, Finn had done the same with his sister. If Blue had his way, the council would listen to him and allow females to enlist. Elf females were only marginally weaker than the elf males. There was no reason for them not to have a place in the army if they desired it. The young female elf brushed her jaw-length black hair from her face, blew a rogue strand upwards, and bowed. Finn grinned. "She's a cocky little runt, don't you think?" His sister glared at him but held her tongue. Blue could see she wanted to retaliate, but his presence was silencing her. "No more cocky than her brother," Blue said, and sighed again as he looked from Finn to Dacian. "Although I would prefer you didn't damage my men when I need them." The female bowed her head again, and Blue smiled inwardly at the same time as Finn's grin widened. It was cruel to tease her, but amusing too. It reminded him of when Iolanthe had been younger, and life had been easier. Dacian groaned, his face contorted, and he rolled onto his side. He slowly pushed himself up and shook his head, dislodging the sand that clung to his shorn hair, and revealing the long scar that cut diagonally across his scalp. It had been a close call the day he had received it. An axe in the back of the head was the sort of injury most elves didn't walk away from. But Dacian had incredible senses and had felt the blade before it had reached him, swiftly calling his helmet to shield his head. The big elf huffed and pushed up onto his knees, sat back on his heels and dusted himself off. When he swung his icy violet gaze towards the female, she squeaked and curled up, squeezing her hands together in front of her chest. Dacian lumbered onto his feet and heaved another sigh, shifting his thickly muscled shoulders with it and causing his honed chest and stomach to tense. He had at least 200 pounds on the poor female, and she wisely backed towards her brother when Dacian advanced on her. "Weapons, you said? A fight with weapons?" Dacian growled through blood-stained fangs, and pinned his violet gaze on the female first and then Finn. Finn tensed, his smile fleeing his face. He shrugged, but it came off stiff. "Telekinesis could be considered a weapon." Not by a warrior like Dacian. The psychic powers available to elves were only used in defense by those of the warrior class, viewed as a last resort when traditional weapons and even claws and fangs failed, and they were close to losing their lives. Dacian snarled, flashing his fangs. The little elf female teleported, reappearing behind her brother, using him as a shield. Not the wisest move. Dacian wasn't the sort of male who cared if he had to go through a friend to get to a foe. His steady, hard gaze shifted back to her, and then he did something that left Blue wondering what the hell had happened to change the male. Dacian backed down, huffing as he strode away from her and her brother, muttering things beneath his breath. Blue eyed him. Maybe he hadn't changed. Maybe Dacian had always been lenient on females. He looked back at the female in question. Or maybe Dacian had a reason to be lenient on this one. She whispered something to Finn, who nodded, and then she teleported. Dacian looked back in Finn's direction, a brief glance before he swiped a gray cloth from the wall near Blue, and rubbed himself down with it. "I take it from your appearance that we have a mission again?" Finn dropped to his feet from the wall and strode across the sand, all humor gone from his face. Blue nodded. "The rumors running around the garrison are true. I encountered the female dragon again, and Prince Lorne has ordered us to complete our mission." All three males nodded in unison, and Blue nodded too, a sense that their mission was finally coming to a close running through him, a familiar feeling that was comforting and made him feel at home. Lorne had given him a purpose, and he was going to fulfill it. "We will not fail this time." Chapter 4. The valley seemed larger from the floor of it, the mountains taller and more forbidding as they loomed over her. She felt small and vulnerable, her step uneasy as she walked forwards despite the voice in her heart that told her to turn back, to leave before he realized she was here. Taryn pulled down a deep breath, wishing it would steady her even though she knew it wouldn't. The last 30 breaths she had sucked in to calm herself had had no effect, so it was ridiculous to expect the 31st to succeed where they had failed. There would be no settling of her fears, not until she had faced them. Her eyes locked on the distant citadel where it rose from the black rock of the mountains at the opposite end of the valley, as if they had birthed it. The sheer spires as pointed and cragged as the peaks beyond it, causing it to blend into the range. It sent a chill through her just to look at it, a place fit for a king but also for a killer. Distant howls of hell beasts mingled with the thunderous boom of rock splitting open in the valleys beyond the one she traversed. But down in the basin of the Valley of the Dark Edge, it was quiet. Ominously quiet. No sign of life stirred in the black land, but the shadows that crawled outwards from the gnarled black trees still made her jittery, causing her to jump at times when a flash of amber light shot up from one of the jagged fault lines she had seen in the other valleys, and made them dance across the obsidian earth, reaching towards her like smoky claws. There was only death in this valley. It surrounded her, always there wherever her gaze fell, the evidence that her brother killed anything that roamed into his domain. Taryn slowed as she passed another set of bones, picked clean and startlingly bright in the dim light that passed for day. This one was the skeleton of a hell beast, enormous and canine-like, with broken horns that protruded from its broad skull. She had fought enough of its kind to recognize one without its flesh. She pulled her gaze away from it and continued walking on a direct path to the castle. It was closer now, but she had been walking for hours and had crossed only a tiny fraction of the valley floor. Another flash of light leaped across the land as lava spewed high in a valley beyond the mountains to her right, and she stopped dead, her heart lodged in her throat and her eyes fixed on the empty pits in the skull just meters ahead of her. Dragon. Tears filled her eyes as she walked towards it, shaking her head as her heart ached. Her eyebrows furrowed as she neared it, and she reached a hand out. It trembled in the air, and her instincts told her to turn away, to not look at the skull of one of her own kind, the damning evidence that her brother had truly lost his mind. He had killed a dragon. Taryn swallowed hard and laid her shaking hand on the beaked snout. The bone was cool beneath her palm, and her senses stretched along it, mapping the shape of the skull, from its enormous teeth to the ridged bone above the eye sockets, to the 4 horns that flared back from the top of the skull, still gold in color. She dashed away the tears in her eyes with her free hand, as she tried not to picture the dragon as it would have been, a beautiful and majestic gold, its scales shimmering and reflecting what little light pierced the dragon realm. Tenak had killed it. He had destroyed its beauty. Gods, she felt sick. She covered her mouth and looked beyond the skull to the shattered bones of its spine and ribs, and the scattered wing bones that lay around it. It had been big, a male, ancient. She turned away, screwed her eyes shut, and fought for air. Her fingers clasped the leather strap across her chest, the power of the magic humming beneath her fierce grip, drawing her focus to the weapon she carried. A sword capable of ending her brother with one blow. She swore to the dragon gods that she would avenge her kin. She would stop her brother. Taryn marched forwards, pinning her gaze on the citadel again, her steps steadier and stronger than they had been in centuries. She knew her purpose, and she wouldn't falter. Her brother had gone mad, and she would stop him before he turned that madness on anyone else. She closed her eyes briefly as she passed the barbed tip of the dragon's tail, and prayed to the gods and her ancestors that she didn't end up like the poor soul. Her step faltered, but she forced herself to keep marching, refused to slow her pace or allow her fear to get the better of her. She had a plan, and she believed in it. Her brother had lost his mind, and to win his trust, she would act as if she had lost hers. She lost herself in going over her plan as she walked, her feet growing sore again in her boots as the miles stacked up. The light in the valley began to fade. Night was falling. The dragon realm was so far from the elf kingdom that the light the Fae brought into their world from the mortal one was weak when it reached it, barely able to drive the darkness back in the day and leaving the world pitch black at night. Her mind filled with images of what that Fae kingdom had looked like, and her bones warmed with the memory of how the light had felt on her skin. It had been so bright that her eyes had hurt, and the land so colorful that it had been like a fantasy, a dream. Did the mortal world look like the elf kingdom? Was it lush and green, threaded with blue rivers, spotted with all the colors possible? Gods, she could imagine that it was, and it made her ache to see it, to fly there as her ancestors had, long ago before they had been banished to hell. Her shoulders itched, her wings aching for freedom, the urge to shift rushing through her once more and pushing at her control. A roar shattered the silence and robbed her of her breath. Terran stiffened. He was coming. A black shadow loomed above the castle, wrapped around it for a heartbeat before it spread enormous wings and took flight. Her fingers shook so hard she struggled to tear the leather cuffs off her wrists, her breath trembling across her lips as she tore at the thick material. "Hurry, hurry, hurry," she chanted as she ripped at the leather and one finally gave way, falling to the earth at her feet. She began to work on the other, her eyes darting between it and the shadowy dragon racing towards her. She had to get the cuffs off to break the spell. It was her only chance of getting him to recognize her. Or at least, she hoped he would recognize her. She ripped the second cuff off just as he landed hard only meters from her, causing the ground to shake and sending a blast of grit at her on a gust of wind that knocked her onto her backside. Pain bolted up her spine from the impact and she ground her teeth. Out of the gloom, a rich, deep violet head emerged, gigantic compared with her in her mortal form. Bright violet eyes focused on her, and the short spines that followed the ridge of bone above them rippled as he snorted, blowing hot air at her and the scent of ash. He growled, a strange disjointed sound that undulated around her, and bared his fangs. They gleamed in the low light, each as long as her arm, as sharp as a blade. Terran didn't dare move. He snorted again, scenting her. She waited, stilled right down to her breathing, willing him to recognize her. She held his gaze, searching it for that glimmer that would tell her that she had succeeded and he knew her. Those enormous violet eyes remained focused and deadly, narrowed on her, showing no sign that he recognized her as his kin, his blood. He shifted back a step, his broad wings folding against his back, so the white membrane was barely visible, and shook his head as he clawed at the ground, long talons raking at the black earth. He was conflicted, unsure of her, but that didn't mean she was safe. He could eat her in one snap of his jaws. Terran risked it and raised her right hand, holding it out to him. His focus darted to it and his elliptical pupils narrowed into nothing more than vertical slits. But then they widened again and she swore she saw a glimmer of recognition in them. He lunged at her and she swiftly rolled out of the path of his strike, narrowly avoiding his bite and launched onto her feet. So she had been wrong and he didn't recognize her. She was quick to run with Plan B, slashing a claw across her palm and spilling her blood as she turned back towards him. Tenak went to lunge at her again but stopped dead, snorted and then inhaled deeply, his white chest expanding as he took a full breath down into his lungs. He exhaled hard, the hot, fierce blast almost knocking her on her backside again, and then growled, the low rumbling sound encompassing her. Her cut hand shook so badly it jumped around all over the place. She caught her wrist with her free hand to steady it, and raised both towards him so he could smell her clearly. This had to work. She had his attention, and this time she was sure he was beginning to recognize her. It was taking him longer than she had expected, but then she had been gone a while and he was lost to the darkness. It had often taken him some time to recognize her during his fits of madness. He breathed in again, the nostrils in his beak flaring, and then lowered his head. Relief swept through her and she bit out a sob, her adrenaline leaving her in an energy-draining rush as Tenak began to shift into his mortal form. The relief was short-lived, as the weight of the sword concealed in the blanket on her back reminded her that she wasn't out of the woods yet. She still had to convince her brother to spare her life and forgive her, and if he sensed the sword she carried, he would do neither of those things. He would kill her. She felt sure of that now. The misguided beliefs that had plagued her during her journey, the lies she had told herself to keep her feet moving forwards, had fallen away now, and she could see clearly. Taryn looked at her twin where he stood before her, deep purple leathers encasing his powerful legs, and his bare chest ridged with the honed muscle of a formidable warrior, his face as she remembered it, but eyes foreign to her. They resembled hers, violet around the outside of his irises and white around his pupils, but while hers were only tinged with madness, his were wild and crazed. He had truly lost his mind. He stalked towards her, standing at least 7 inches taller, radiating danger and deadliness that made her want to back away. It was a struggle to hold her ground, but she managed it. She didn't manage to hold back the flinch and the gasp when he shot a hand out, grasped the back of her neck and hauled her up to him, though, forcing her head back and her eyes up to his. He snarled through teeth that were still all sharp.
"Why have you returned to me? After you left me, alone in this dark world, without you."
Taryn breathed hard, heart hammering and blood pounding as she shook from head to toe. His claws pressed into the sides of her throat, his grip on her nape fierce and unyielding, and she feared he would break her neck. Her eyes darted between his, so familiar but so foreign, as if there was something else living inside her brother's body, a sick beast that had driven the good male out and taken residence within him. The pressure of his grip increased. Memories surged. Cold steel pressing on the back of her neck, heavy on her wrists, her ankles. Tenak blurred in her vision as she went limp, her strength giving out, and she felt his arms around her, supporting her as she collapsed under the weight of her past. He came back into focus, sharper than ever as her mind crumbled. And gods, she hated acting like him, acting mad with a hunger for revenge against the kingdoms, because it came too easy for her, and she feared it would swallow her whole and she would truly become like him. She clawed at his chest, tried to break free of his hold. She needed to fly. He refused to release her, and she curled her hands into fists and beat them against his shoulders. She wriggled, and his grip on her tightened, sending her deeper under the tide of her memories. Hands on her, hands, touching. Taryn roared and gave one mighty shove, catching him in the face with her bloodied right palm and his chest with her left. His grip gave out, and she stumbled free of his arms, twisting and staggering away from him. She couldn't breathe. Cold steel, heavy. She had to fly. She clawed at her hair and collapsed to her knees as the black mountains closed in around her like the walls of a cage.
"Sister."
Tenak's deep voice wobbled in her mind, distorting into that of others, the males who had purchased her, who had tried to break her. She shook her head and curled over, breathing hard against her knees, fighting back as she tried to claw her way towards the light and shed the grip of the darkness.
"I did not leave you,"
she snarled as tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto her knees to roll down the black leather.
"I was taken."
"Taken," he snarled, and the darkness in that single word frightened her. She shrieked as hands caught her and pulled her onto her feet, twisted her to face their owner, and lashed out, clawing at the male. The scent of blood hit her, and her fight fled her body, her muscles turning liquid again beneath her flesh. Her brother. Taryn hurled herself at his chest, buried her face against his neck, and shuddered as she sobbed. He was still for a moment, and then his arms carefully closed around her. The touch meant to comfort, but all it did was terrify her. She broke free again and paced away from him, clawing her hair back from her face as she breathed hard and fast, chanted in her head that it was over. She was safe now, free. Free. She was free. She needed to fly.
"Who took you from me?"
Who indeed? She looked back over her shoulder at her brother, recognizing him this time. Her precious brother, his face bloodied and chest streaked with crimson that dripped from dark slashes. The darkness in his eyes pleased her now, the hunger to maim and kill, the same darkness and hunger that beat in her heart.
"Slavers,"
she whispered, filled with a ridiculous fear they might hear her and come for her again, might find her here. That fear turned to hope a moment later. She snarled and willed them to try and take her, to come and see what her brother would do to them. He would make them pay. The increasing darkness in his eyes warned that she was speaking her thoughts aloud, and they pleased him. He already wanted to kill those who had hurt her, and she would give him more cause to want their blood on his hands, would weave a lie to draw him to her side.
"They took the sword. I only stole it because I wanted power like you. I was going to use the sword to get it,"
she muttered, and his face darkened at the mention of the blade she had taken from him.
"I wanted to be powerful too. I was going to give it back. I wanted to be like you."
She fell to her knees again and scratched at the earth, feeling that maybe she was already like him. Mad.
"I kept track of it, but I lost it. The second male who bought me hid it."
"Second?" Tenax snarled and came to tower over her again, a formidable sight as his eyes glowed with violet fire. "How many?" She was glad he couldn't finish that sentence, because she was finding it hard to keep the memories at bay enough to spin her web and catch him in it as it was. It wouldn't take much to push her back over the edge. "6, she whispered, and fought the faces of her owners as they came to her, pushing them back down inside her, refusing to look at them or those of the people who had traded her.
"There were 6 before I escaped."
Escaped. When the elf was there. The elf. She looked down at her dirtied, bloodied hands, at claws that had marked him. He would be coming for her. She was sure of that. She was sure that he had been hunting for her since their paths had crossed again 3 lunar cycles ago. Taryn lifted her eyes to Tenax's face, and he hunkered down in front of her, his steady violet-to-white gaze so warm and soft, so beautifully familiar and comforting now that she wanted to cry. She tensed when he reached for her, but then she was in his arms, held gently against his bare chest, his warmth seeping into her, and all she could do was rest there and let him be strong for her. He growled low in her ear, "I swear, together we shall make all of hell pay for what they have done to you." Gods, that sounded dangerously appealing. Taryn sat with her head against his shoulder, her eyes fixed on the black mountains in the direction she had come, her bones vibrating with awareness that urged her to move faster, to accelerate her plan. The elf was coming. He believed her responsible for stealing the blade and attacking the elf kingdom 7 long centuries ago, killing thousands of his kind. He could never feel anything for her other than hatred, and she had been fine with that, because it had meant he would never end up at the mercy of her brother. But now she had delayed too long, and her dragon instincts warned that he was closing in on her. And when that happened, the future would grow clouded and uncertain, both for her and for the elf, her fated male. Chapter 5. His mouth caressed sweet fire across the top of her breasts, breathed it up the line of her throat, and seared her lips with it as he claimed them again, his fierce inhale stirring the embers that burned in her blood too, setting it aflame. Taryn arched up against him, desperate with a need to feel his body against hers. Cold scales greeted her bare flesh, but couldn't cool the fire burning inside her, a flame he had lit 7 centuries ago. She moaned into his mouth as he plundered hers, the dominance of his kiss driving her deeper into her desire, and stirring it to staggering new heights. She mewled, clawed at his arms, craved the feel of his warm skin beneath her fingers and his lips on her throat, fangs in her neck. He drew back, breaking away from her lips and denying her. His wicked smile drew a growl from her that caused it to only grow wider, more amused as he tortured her with his distance. She caught him around the nape of his neck and pulled him back down to her, tore a sweet gasp from his lips as she hooked her right leg around his backside and rolled him over, landing on top of him. It was her turn. She had been a slave to him for long enough, letting him master her. It was time she mastered him. She pressed her hands into his chest, her belly fluttering at the hard feel of it beneath her palms, all power and strength. It spoke to her dragon instincts, fanned her desire until it burned hotter, and all she could think about was fulfilling her need of him, her male. He gazed up at her, his wild blue-black hair tousled and blending into the black rock that was his bed as she sat astride him. Those bright violet eyes challenged hers, held her still with a steadiness and confidence that made her tremble. He knew she was afraid to take charge, had lived her life in the shadow of her brother, held under his yoke, and he wanted to see if she could rise to the task of taking command. She could. Taryn threw off her fears and palmed his chest through the small black scales of his armor, skimming them down to feel his pebbled nipples beneath them. He moaned, the strangled sound delighting her together with the way he tipped his head back, his eyelids dropping to steal those dazzling jewels from her gaze. Pleasure. She could feel it rolling through him, already building towards a crescendo. A powerful peak of desire that she knew would leave her quivering from head to toe, trembling and boneless, and would do the same to him. With little more than a thought, she peeled back his armor, watched it as the scales swept over his pale skin, and revealed it to her. His violet eyes darkened as his armor cleared his legs in its race toward the twin metal bands around his wrists, and she groaned as the hot steel length at the juncture of his thighs kicked against her, brushing between her legs. His hands clamped down on her hips, and he held her in place as he lifted his, grinding his rigid shaft against her core, each undulation of his hips making the head caress her aroused nub. She trembled, breath stuttering as bliss rolled through her in time with his movements, ebbing and flowing, pushing her higher. His deep male growl of satisfaction and the feel of his eyes on her, the hot shivery ache that coursed through her whenever he gazed at her, combined to tear an answering moan from her lips. Gods, she needed him. She couldn't remember a time when she hadn't dreamed of him, yearned for him, even when she knew this was all she could have of him. Taryn tipped her head back, felt the heat of his gaze on her throat before it drifted lower, settling on her breasts. She held back her smile as she lifted her hands and teased her nipples, rolling them between her fingers and teasing him at the same time. His hips thrust harder between hers, sliding the entire length of his cock along her slick core. His guttural groan sent a thrill through her, shot fire to her belly that pooled lower. His next thrust spread the new flood of desire that flowed from her along his hard length, making it slide easily to the pert bead that craved his touch. She bit her lip and trailed her hands down from her breasts, aching for more. He beat her there, his hands skimming over her thighs and dipping down. His thumbs brushed the edges of her groin and she moaned. The sound ripped from her throat before she could contain it. She could almost feel his satisfied smile as he edged closer to where she needed him. Her nub pulsed, body flexing against her will and eagerness, hungry for his touch. His thumb brushed her and she shuddered, a wildfire burning up her blood, rushing through every inch of her. He pressed the pad of it against her, holding it there and tormenting her. Taryn dropped her chin and growled at him, flashing her teeth. His eyes darkened further, the hunger in them arousing her to the point of pain, and she couldn't keep still. She lowered her hips and rocked on him, rubbing herself up and down his length, causing his thumb to shift against her and tease the aching bead. Her breathing came quicker, falling into a rhythm with his as he swirled that thumb around her and she fell forwards, bracing herself on her palms against his bare chest. His flesh was warm beneath them, muscles hard and corded, his entire body tensed and on delicious display as she ground against him. When she moved further forwards, causing the blunt head of his cock to brush her entrance, he bared his fangs at her and his ears flattened against the sides of his head, growing more pointed and luring her gaze to them. She ran her hands up his chest and his neck, leaning over him, stealing her body away from his. He growled, the sound one of irritation now, frustration that she had removed herself from him. The anger dissipated the moment her fingertips brushed his ear, trailed upwards to the pointed tip, and teased it. He groaned low in his throat, wrapped his arms around her, and pressed down on her bottom, bringing her back into contact with him, in line with the wild jerks of his hips as she stroked his pointed ears. His nails dug into her backside as she leaned closer to him, his hips lifting to keep their bodies together. She brushed her lips across his, a brief sweep that had him moaning, and then shifted her head to one side, stealing her mouth away from him and earning another reprimanding growl. She killed that one too, transforming it into a moan as she tongued his ear, licking from the lobe up to the tip. "Gods," he breathed in her ear, and clung to her, pinning her against him as he thrust between her legs. She moaned and shuddered, embracing the fire burning through her whenever the head of his cock rubbed her sweet spot, ached to feel him buried deep inside her, claiming her. She flicked the pointed tip of his ear with her tongue, and he trembled, barked out a moan that had her smiling wickedly, her confidence shooting into the stratosphere. She owned him now. He was under her command, a slave to her. Taryn squeaked as he was suddenly on top of her, his hands braced on either side of her ribs and his hips nestled between hers, his cock pressing delightfully along the length of her with the tip resting against her nub. His wicked smile beat hers hands down. His violet eyes dropped from hers to her lips, and she silently pleaded for him to take her mouth, take her body. He seized her lips in another demanding kiss, and she arched against him, unable to stop herself. She moaned as his tongue stroked the seam of her lips and opened to him. He thrust past her teeth, and she met him, tangled with him and fought him back. He groaned and settled his weight on her, dropping to his elbows as he began to thrust, rocking between her thighs, teasing her ever higher. He shook when she stroked his right fang with her tongue, teasing it as she had his ear. It was sharp, reminding her of her own fangs when she was in dragon form. She pressed the tip of her tongue to the point, and the coppery tang of blood flooded her mouth. He groaned, thrust harder against her, kissed her deeper, hungry for a taste of her. She could feel it in him, the need, the yearning, the craving to taste her. It ran as deep in his blood as it did in hers. He broke away from her lips and kissed along her jaw, shifting his body down hers at the same time, stealing his cock away from her. She still couldn't stop her hips from rocking, thrusting to meet only air, her mind frazzled by the feel of his lips on her throat. He sucked and licked, teased with nips of his teeth that didn't break her skin, driving her wild. She couldn't take it. She clawed at his shoulders, and he stilled, going tense above her. The scent of blood grew thick in the air. She gasped as she saw what she had done, scoring her talons across his flesh, and leaving vicious grooves in his skin that swelled with crimson. Her eyes leaped to his, meeting their darkening depths, and she swallowed hard. "Blood for blood," he whispered in a husky, deep voice, thick with desire. She didn't have a chance to respond. Stars exploded across the black ceiling above him as his fangs sank deep into her throat, and her body jacked off the ground as he pulled on her blood, sending it all rushing towards him and causing an inferno to sweep through her in its wake. She moaned with each pull, grasped his shoulders and stayed locked in position, her backside lifted off the black earth and pressed against his. He drank deeper, his noisy suckling filling the thick air together with her panted breaths. His left hand skimmed down her spine, across her bottom and over her thigh. A moan quivered on her lips as his thumb pressed into her pert bead, and 2 fingers speared her core, sliding easily into her slick flesh. He pumped her steadily in time with his drinking, lifting her ever closer to release that still felt painfully beyond her reach. His thumb swirled around her nub as he thrust his fingers, and she flexed around them, her body beyond her control as she sought a climax she knew would scatter her in pieces. His fangs sank deeper into her throat, and she balanced on the edge, trembling there. He denied her, slipping his fingers free of her flesh and left her bereft. She opened her mouth to plead him to return to her, but he denied her again, removing his fangs from her as he drew back, rising above her. Blood coated his lips and dripped down his chin, and God's help her, but she wanted to kiss him, found the sight of him fresh from tasting her the most erotic thing she had ever seen. His eyes held hers, fierce amethyst that stole her voice and commanded stillness from her, pulling her firmly under his spell. His hand brushed her inner thigh, and then the blunt head of his length nudged against her slick channel, and she moaned, unable to contain the sound as pleasure rippled through her, hunger so fierce it was hard to keep still as he slowly pressed forwards, on the verge of filling her at last. His fangs flashed between his lips as he growled down at her. "Mine now." A distant roar shattered him into a million pieces that rained down on her, and she gasped as darkness engulfed her, and then a single flickering golden light broke through it. She stared across the large, sparsely furnished room at the candle burning on the mantelpiece, her heart hammering against her chest, and breath coming so quickly she felt dizzy. An echo of pleasure still rippled through her, a shadow of what she had felt in her dream. She raised trembling fingers to her throat, to the place where he had marked her. Her fated male. Fated. She snarled. She had decided long ago that fate was cruel. It had been cruel to show him to her 7 centuries ago and make her recognize him for what he was. It had been cruel to choose him as the one who hunted for her, believing her a murderer and a thief, making him bent on killing her. It was cruel to tease her with him in her dreams each night, the only place where they could be together. Taryn drew her knees up to her chest and breathed out slowly, the candle becoming a hazy blur of light as her body tingled with unfulfilled need, an endless hunger for her mate. He was coming. She could feel it in her bones and her blood. He was coming, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to face him again, to see the darkness in his stunning eyes that was directed at her, the hatred and the venom, the desire to end her. She closed her eyes, but all she saw was the vision Loki had witnessed, one she now felt sure would come to pass, and nothing she could do would stop it from happening. Fate was cruel indeed, because it had made her mate her executioner. Chapter 6. Blue was 300% certain that this was a bad idea. He had left Leif, Flynn, and Dacian at the stronghold they had used during their previous hunt for the female dragon and the sword, a stone fortress long abandoned by the elf legions, left to rot because it now stood on a peaceful border between the elf kingdom and the first realm of the demons. Prince Loren had negotiated a treaty with the first and second realms centuries ago, the only two that bordered the elf kingdom. That treaty had created a barrier between the elf kingdom and the other 5 demon realms, stopping them from marching into elven lands and bringing war to Loren's doorstep. War born of fury over the heinous acts committed in their lands by an elf. Blue eyed the quaint thatched cottage nestled on the fringe of a quiet village and surrounded by a vibrant walled garden and lush English countryside. The noon sunlight warmed the old sandstone of the small 1.5-story cottage and glinted off the small windows on the ground floor and those in the roof. The reeds used to create the roof arched over each window in a sweeping curve that made Blue feel as if nature herself had built the home. Such a peaceful place, it was almost impossible to picture the elf male he had come to visit living in it. The elf who had been responsible for the atrocities in the demon realms and many more. Vale. Blue had been standing here on the narrow, silent road just a few hundred feet from the cottage for the gods only knew how long, debating whether to proceed with his prince's plan to speak with his tainted brother about the sword. His gut said it was a terrible idea, and it was difficult to ignore that, or the voice that whispered he should have brought backup with him. Blue shook his head. He had been right to order his men to remain at their temporary headquarters, getting it back into order and ready for their hunt, resupplying it with weapons and anything else they needed from the castle. It was important that they were prepared, and that any elves who had moved into the vicinity of the garrison were removed to a safe distance. The lands around it had been empty on both sides 300 years ago, making it the ideal place to set up base, because if the dragon attacked them, it would only be him and his men in the firing line. Blue hoped that was still the case. He had no desire to drag innocents into this war. It was also important that he didn't anger the elf he was about to visit, and he knew the male well enough, had fought him enough times over the past 42 centuries, that he knew Vale would view a band of 4 warriors as a threat, both to him and his mate. As the sun crept lower, leaving its zenith, and a warm breeze teased the bright red roses that clung to the rough creamy walls of the cottage, and the colorful rose bushes that lined the path to the front door, Blue blew out a breath and marched forwards. To his doom, probably. This was not going to go well. He approached the low wall enclosing the garden and cottage, his steps silent on the road. A bird sang in the distance, the beautiful song offering him comfort as his heart pounded hard against his breast. He reached his senses out, digging them deep into the nature that surrounded him, drawing strength from it as all elves did. His hand shook as he reached for the low wooden gate and he tensed to steady it, a brief flex of muscle that did the trick. He pushed the bleached, arched gate open and strode down the path, the hem of the long black coat he wore over his armor swirling around his ankles. A soft female voice rang out from the rear of the cottage and Blue diverted course, following the narrow golden gravel path that cut through lavender and rosemary bushes and curved towards the right side of the house. He rounded the building and spotted Rosalind hanging washing on a line supported between 2 apple trees, her long black dress reaching her knees and a grim contrast against her wavy ash-blonde hair. The breeze blew again and she muttered a ripe curse not suited to her delicate appearance as she wrestled with her hair, tugging it out of her face.
"Hand me those pegs."
She pointed to a small bag hanging at the end of the line furthest from Blue.
"Rosalind?"
Blue said. Her head snapped around, blue eyes enormous and rosy lips parted. An unholy snarl sounded, and then Vale was right in front of him, standing between him and Rosalind, his skin-tight armor in place and fangs enormous as he flashed them at Blue. He backed towards his mate, his right hand stretched behind him, snarling the whole time. He reached Rosalind and caught hold of her waist, his black-clawed fingers blending into her dress as he guided her behind him.
"Leave! Keep away from my Kiara! She is mine!"
Vale snarled in the elf tongue, his tone as black as midnight in the demon realms. His ears grew pointier, flaring back against the wild strands of his blue-black hair, and every instinct Blue possessed fired in response to the threat. It took all of his will to stop himself from hissing back at the wretched male. It was only Rosalind's soft apologetic look when she leaned to one side, peering past her mate, that stopped him.
"I am not interested in your mate,"
Blue muttered in his native language.
"What is it with you and Lauren and your females?"
A frown flickered on Vale's face at the mention of his brother, and then his eyes darkened dangerously, black encroaching to swallow the violet. Blue held his ground, body vibrating with awareness of what was about to happen. He had seen that look in Vale's eyes enough times to know to brace himself and prepare for a fight. Rosalind gently laid her hand on Vale's right shoulder, and Blue couldn't believe his eyes as the vicious male transformed before them, that delicate hand taming the beast. The dark hunger for violence disappeared from Vale's eyes in an instant, becoming a soft but pleading look as he turned them on his mate. She stepped up beside him, her left hand still on his shoulder, and stroked his arm with her right, all the way down to the sharp tips of his claws. Vale's gaze followed the path of her fingers, and his shoulders relaxed as she worked whatever magic she was casting on him. Not magic involving spells and potions, nature's magic. A magic he didn't want to think about because it was already souring his mood, and that had been rather sour to begin with. Love. It was there in that touch, in that stupid soft look on Vale's face, and the smile on Rosalind's lips. Blue wanted to retch. He cleared his throat instead, gaining a far more palatable snarl and black look from Vale. Rosalind petted Vale's hand.
"Let him speak. He's here for our help."
Vale turned that scowl on his mate.
"He is not to be trusted. You vowed he would never come here."
She had. That stung. Blue had thought them something akin to acquaintances, if not close to friends, after everything they had been through. The darkness in Vale's eyes shifted again, lightening as his eyebrows furrowed and he stooped to catch Rosalind's hand. He brought it up to his armored chest and stared down into her eyes, his violet ones pleading, as mercurial as ever. Vale's mood always had been dangerously unpredictable.
"He is dangerous. Make him go away. He will seek to harm me through you, and I cannot bear it."
Now Blue was just offended.
"I will not. And besides, I knew Rosalind first."
Vale hissed at him, his eyes almost jet black and pointed ears flattening against the sides of his head. The elf male released Rosalind's hand and turned on him, the black slashes of his eyebrows dropping so low that his eyes were nothing more than slits as he glared at Blue.
"What do you mean?"
Vale bit out, and then snapped back to Rosalind, his eyes wild and filled with hurt.
"Did you lie? Did the foul creature truly admire you in the third realm? Did he desire you? Did you—"
Rosalind pressed a finger to his lips.
"Nothing happened between us. I only said those things to make you jealous so I would know your feelings for me."
Blue arched his left eyebrow at that, and being termed a foul creature. It seemed Vale's opinion of him was as low as Blue's opinion of Vale. And what the hell had Rosalind been thinking, using him as a method of making Vale jealous? No wonder the male hated him and didn't trust him.
"I love you and only you,"
Rosalind whispered, her head tipped back and blue eyes fixed on her mate's violet ones. Vale's expression softened, but it didn't last long. Storm clouds descended again, darker than ever as he slid his gaze towards Blue.
"I still desire the male to leave."
His eyes dropped back to Rosalind, and emotions danced across his face as his eyebrows furrowed.
"I do not wish to be reminded of the things I have done. Not today. Please."
Rosalind offered her mate a sympathetic smile and opened her arms to him. Vale stepped into them, stooped and clasped her to him as he buried his face in her fall of golden hair. She held him, cupping the back of his neck, stroking the shorter lengths of his blue-black hair. When she blinked, her eyes darted from the trees behind Vale straight to Blue, and starlight flickered in their blue depths as they darkened, the sense of power he felt flowing from her growing stronger. Blue shifted back a step, and that was when it hit him. The reason why Vale was troubled today, more so than usual. His stomach dropped to his feet, the space in his chest going cold as he cursed himself for not realizing it earlier. He could have avoided disturbing Vale, upsetting him, if he had chosen any day other than today to visit him. Any day other than the anniversary of the one on which, all those thousands of years ago, Vale had fallen under Cordula's spell and attacked his own men, slaughtering most of his legion, a battle Blue had barely escaped with his life. Rosalind murmured softly to Vale, and his fingers tightened against her waist, black claws pressing in to clutch her, as if she was the only anchor in the storm of the emotions battering him. Blue could sense the turmoil and pain in him, hurt that he had caused. He backed off another step, an apology balanced on his lips, but then he remembered why he had come. He couldn't leave without asking for their help. The fate of thousands, no, millions of lives depended on him now, and on Vale. He looked at the male, feeling deep in his gut and his heart that this was Vale's chance, his shot at taking a giant leap towards redeeming himself. The elf had taken thousands of lives over the last 42 centuries, but he could save millions in the next few minutes.
"I didn't know," Blue said. "I am not here because of that. I am here because I require your help. I need to find the sword."
Confusion crinkled Rosalind's fair eyebrows. Her mate instantly lifted his head, turning sharp violet eyes on Blue.
"The sword."
Blue nodded. While his mate didn't know what they were talking about, Vale knew exactly what sword he was looking for, and was aware of what had happened to it 7 centuries ago. And the determination steadily growing in his eyes said that he was willing to help. Vale opened his mouth to speak. The air off to his left shimmered, and another elf appeared on bended knee, breathing hard, black stilted ribbons like smoke twisting around him. Blue stilled right down to his breathing, tensing in perfect unison with Vale, unable to believe what he was seeing. Fury. The tainted elf raised his head, black eyes locking on Vale's face for a split second before they dropped to his boots and he bent his head lower. The tangled strands of his shoulder-length black hair swept forwards to conceal his face, but Blue could feel the agony as it rolled off him. His bare fingers dug into the earth, bunching the grass into shaking fists. Blue couldn't take his eyes off the male as he was hurled through time. A night barely a few months ago rose around him, reconstructing itself as if he truly had leaped through time. He saw Fury standing across from him in Kiter's nightclub, a black and terrible shadow in the dimly lit expansive room. His eyes filled with darkness and lust for bloodshed, claws itching to destroy and take the lives of all he viewed as an enemy. A shadow of the noble male Blue had known as a youth. That Fury whirled back in time with him, to a battlefield where he loomed over him, his hand outstretched. Blue saw himself take it, swore he felt the breeze as he was pulled onto his feet, and saw Fury's lips move in silent words that he felt warming his soul and boosting his courage before the elf turned away from him. He raised his black blade, his head held high, violet eyes bright and focused on the enemy as he commanded the legion to move forwards. Blue could only stare as he kicked off and swept through the enemy, cutting them down with ease and leading the charge. A male Blue had adored, admired, and aspired to be, and had mourned, grieved for while flooded with pain so fierce it had felt as if his soul had been tearing apart. The present Fury moved, causing the past to swirl into a maelstrom of colorful smoke and dissipate.
"Commander Fury,"
Blue whispered, lost all over again, as rattled by his presence as he had been back in Kiter's nightclub. He had lived 4,000 years believing him dead, murdered by the male who was looking down at him through astonished violet eyes that seemed to reflect all of Blue's feelings. He couldn't breathe. Blue stumbled back a step as the past rushed back, sweeping him along in a torrent too strong for him to fight, impossible for him to break free of and find solid ground again. Rosalind shifted her gaze to him, and it filled with concern, her fingers twisting in front of her as she bit her lower lip. He knew she wanted to come and aid him, but it would be a dangerous move, one liable to cause her mate to turn on him, Fury, and possibly even her. Blue shook his head, silently telling her that he would find his balance again. He just needed a moment. Gods, he needed a moment to breathe. An image of the silent forest in the fifth realm filled his mind, called to him to return to it as he had so many times, finding peace in the solitude and beauty of the place. He fought for the strength to push away from that urge, aware that it had served a purpose far different from the one he had believed. It had become his place to hide whenever things had become too intense for him, too painful to handle. He had buried himself in nature, craving the soothing touch of her, to rid himself of the cold emptiness that had invaded his very soul. The loneliness. Vale canted his head, causing strands of his wild blue-black hair to drop and brush his brow, his violet eyes pinned on Fury, his second in command. His chest heaved with each deep breath he drew, stretching the scales of his armor, and his fingers curled into claws at his sides. His eyes darkened dangerously. Blue waited for him to explode. If seeing Fury again had caused Blue shock, even when he had crossed paths with the male just months ago, then he couldn't imagine what it was doing to Vale, and on today of all days. They both had awful timing. Fury lifted his head again, his face twisted in pain, a broken male that Blue wasn't sure was quite with the world. The darkness was strong in him, his tainted soul showing in his black eyes, barely a sliver of violet remaining in them. Vale stepped towards him. Blue held his breath, convinced that Vale was about to turn violet because of the day they had all chosen to invade his life. Fury clawed at the ground. Even Blue could see how shattered he was, only a fragment of the male he had once been, and that he was adrift, a lost little thing floating on an endless sea of pain, suffering. Gods, he was about to suffer a lot more. Vale stopped right in front of Fury, slowly crouched and raised his right hand. Not in a vicious strike, but in a soft touch, a gentle cupping of Fury's ashen cheek in his palm. Blue's breath rushed from him, and he could only stare at Vale and Fury, marveling at how different Vale was as the corners of his lips pulled into a very strained and forced smile. He was trying to master the darkness inside him. The hunger that Blue knew had to be filling him, urging him to lash out at those who might hurt him and his mate. Blue could see it all in his eyes as the black fought the violet, the darkness pushing for control. He was trying to be a better male. Rosalind's smile said it all as she watched him interacting with Fury.
"I'm glad you are alive,"
Vale whispered in a low voice, one filled with a tone meant to be calming and soothing.
"But you are not well."
Fury closed his eyes, hiding his black irises, and lowered his head. Blue had been shocked by the extent of the darkness in him, the hold it had on him, when he had met Fury again in the nightclub. He had seen it control Fury, driving him into a rage, and had seen another elf, Heart, bring him back from the abyss. Not the damned edge, but the black abyss itself. Fury was more than tainted. He was lost. They had squads who hunted his kind and dealt with them in the only way the kingdom condoned, killing them. The tainted were viewed as black marks on the name of the elves, spoken about in fearful whispers among the population, and used as a constant reminder to do good, and hold back the seed of darkness that lived within the souls of all elves. No one spoke of the lost. No one was brave enough.
"This garden seems to work miracles,"
Vale continued and lifted Fury's head, silently commanding the male to look at him. Fury's near-black eyes darted between his, and he swallowed hard, a look on his face that was somewhere between imploring and astonished, as if Fury craved Vale's attention and affection, but couldn't believe he was being given it or deserved it.
"It has given me back much of my light. It holds back the darkness for me. Perhaps it might do the same for you."
Fury looked as if he might pass out. Blue willed the poor bastard to breathe, to just open himself up and believe that Vale wanted to help him, accepting it as real. Vale looked over his shoulder at Rosalind, seeking her permission. Blue wanted to bite out a warning to her. Fury was dangerous, and Blue didn't think there was any way of bringing him back to the light. He was too far gone. Vale was tainted by darkness, but not to this degree. Blue could see the hope in Vale's eyes, though, the need to believe that it was possible to completely erase the black stains from an elf's soul. He needed to help Fury, and not only because he probably felt responsible for what had happened to him. He needed it because it would help him, too. It would strengthen his belief that he could be saved.
"We have room for a guest,"
Rosalind said with a steady, soft smile.
"But we really must speak with Blue first. Remember?"
Vale looked lost, as if he had forgotten all about Blue, which went down about as well as a mug of hydrotoxin. He schooled his expression when the elf male looked his way, hiding his irritation from him. The male nodded and rose to his feet. Fury immediately grasped hold of his left leg, clinging to it. Vale reached down and stroked his fingers through Fury's long hair, and Blue couldn't help but wonder how it was all going to end. Fury was insane, madder than Vale had ever been. If Vale managed to redeem him, to bring him back from the darkness even only enough to bring just a touch more violet back to his eyes, it would be a miracle.
"Don't linger too long, Vale."
Rosalind gestured towards the house after her mate acknowledged her with a brief glance in her direction, and started towards it. Blue was swift to follow her and caught her before she reached the arched wooden door at the rear of the property.
"It is unwise to have a tainted elf in your home,"
he said. She smiled gently at him, warmth in her bright blue eyes as she pushed the door open.
"I know that, but Vale needs him here. He needs company he trusts, and he does get horribly bored when I have to work. It'll be good for him."
She made Fury sound like a damned pet. Not the violent assassin Blue had seen hungering to kill both friend and foe.
"I do not think it will be good for you at all. Fury is dangerous,"
Blue muttered, stooped and followed her into the small kitchen of her home, careful to avoid banging his head on the dark wooden beams that ran across the low, pale ceiling. Rosalind gazed out of the leaded window at her mate, her smile growing wider.
"You don't have to worry about me. I can handle the elf if I have to, but I don't think I will. Vale won't let anyone hurt me."
He had to concede that point. Vale would probably kill Fury if he tried to harm Rosalind. It didn't mean she was safe, though. Fury was as old as Vale and just as powerful. Plus, he had spent the past gods knew how long as an assassin. There was a chance that Fury might win if they fought. Blue rolled his right shoulder in a shrug that felt anything but casual, and those damned feelings he tried to let run off his back refused to do just that. He looked away from her.
"Be careful anyway."
He felt her gaze on him, piercing and powerful, as if she could look right down to his soul with just a glance, and ignored her as he tried to tamp down his unruly emotions. He wasn't in the habit of showing anyone he cared. Not anymore, but everything was piling up on his shoulders, and it was getting more difficult to let it all just roll off him as he usually did, not letting it sink below the surface of his skin. It all became too much, his feelings colliding within him, mingled with the knowing looks that both Lauren and Rosalind had given him, ones that drew him close to admitting things that were best kept unspoken and unacknowledged. He turned his thoughts to the female dragon, and the turbulent flow of emotions quickly calmed, becoming as still as a mill pond within him and restoring his focus on the only thing that mattered to him, his mission. Chapter 7. The back door to Blue's left opened and Vale stalked in, swiftly placing himself between him and Rosalind. Was Vale always going to treat him with mistrust now? It wasn't their checkered past that had the elf male wary around him, firmly on the edge either. It was Rosalind's fault. She had stamped an image of them together on Vale's mind during their courtship, branding Blue as a rival during a time when Vale had been ruled by his instincts as her fated male. Vale was never going to trust him again.
"Tea?"
Rosalind said, her voice light and airy in the thick, heavy silence. He shook his head at the same time as Vale. She muttered something under her breath and stomped off, heading towards the center of the cottage. Blue waited for Vale to follow her before daring to move. He had been to the cottage before, so he knew the way to her drawing room, but decided it was best he followed close on Vale's heels, so the male knew where he was. Vale ducked under the doorframe in the left wall of the narrow hallway that ended at the front door. Blue followed him inside, his gaze immediately running over the familiar room. It was as messy as ever, with books stacked everywhere and on everything besides the green velvet armchairs that nestled around the Inglenook fireplace to his left. Rosalind arranged her black dress and sat on the one with its back to the leaded window. The colorful roses continued to sway in the breeze, the dazzling sunlight bathing them in life, and he itched to be outside again, immersed in nature. An unsettling sensation slithered over his skin beneath his armor, and he looked across at Vale to find the male glaring at him again, his eyes narrowed and verging on black.
"Sit,"
Vale snapped, and Rosalind chastised him with a frown of her own. He glanced at her, and his face lost all darkness, and Blue could only marvel at the extent of her effect on him. But then that seemed to be a problem among mated males. All the ones Blue knew acted as if they'd had their balls cut off when their female was upset with them. All the more reason to remain free of a bond. He liked his balls the way they were.
"Take a seat,"
Rosalind said, without taking her eyes off her mate, and Blue guessed the offer was aimed at him, not Vale. Vale remained standing and folded his arms across his chest as Blue took the armchair opposite Rosalind and knocked a small bundle of books over with his boot, scattering them across the gray slate floor. Vale's expression darkened again.
"Never mind."
Rosalind got off her chair, crouched, and stacked the books. She looked back at Vale.
"See? No harm done."
Vale didn't look convinced. Why hadn't she used her magic? When Blue had been here before, she had moved furniture with it. It would have been easy for her to wave a hand and restack the books. It dawned on him that Vale was the reason. He had a penchant for killing witches, and Blue had seen magic send him off the deep end and into a black rage before, unleashing the darkness within him. He recalled what Rosalind had said about Vale getting bored when she had to work. Bored because he stayed away from her when she was using magic, occupying himself elsewhere, beyond the sphere her power would taint. Rosalind walked over to a worn leather chaise longue below the window and started dragging it towards the fireplace. Vale went to her, gently removed her hands from it and pulled it for her, effortlessly moving it into place with the curved armrest closest to her chair. He sat down on it and glared at Blue again. Blue took it as a cue to speak.
I need your help tracking the sword. I need to use your connection to it to locate it.
Vale looked troubled and shifted his gaze to Rosalind. She sat beside him and placed her hand on his right knee, and the slender male dropped his focus to it, his expression turning lost again. No, not lost. Afraid. He feared what Blue was asking him to do. Why? Vale swallowed hard and closed his violet eyes, turning his noble profile to Blue, and reminding him just how alike he and Lauren looked.
My bond with the sword is strong because of my blood, but it is weak in this realm.
There was an edge to those words, a tremor that spoke of the fear Blue had noticed.
Perhaps it would be better to ask.
Vale cut himself off and turned his face completely towards Rosalind, and she squeezed his knee.
Lauren sent Blue here, and that means he needs your help. No one is forcing you to do this, Vale. If you're not comfortable, you can say so.
Rosalind smiled at her mate as he opened his eyes, leaned back against the couch with a weary sigh, and looked into hers, a soft edge to his that spoke of love so deep that Blue wanted to retch again. Mates. He suppressed a shudder. Gods forbid he ever found his. The tiny voice in the pit of his soul whispered that he wanted to find her. Hadn't he been searching for her for millennia? Waiting for her for centuries? Hunting for her? He frowned at that and shoved the thought aside, refocusing his attention on Vale and willing the male to agree to help him.
I've tracked the one who stole the sword back to her realm of dragons, but I need a location, somewhere to look. The realms are vast.
Blue leaned forwards, resting his elbows on his knees, feeling the rippled surface of his armor pressing into them as it gave beneath the pressure.
If I could uncover her location, I am certain I will be able to retrieve the sword for your brother.
Vale's expression grew softer, warmer still, and Blue felt like a bastard for playing on his love of Lauren to convince him to agree to help him. Lauren would throw him in the cells, or worse, if Vale hurt himself trying to sense the sword's location. But Vale was their best shot, as Lauren knew, and Blue couldn't head into the dragon realm without a clue about where to search for the sword. Not only would it take him months to scour the land, but he would probably end up as roasted elf, together with the rest of his team. That much questioning of dragons was bound to stir some rage somewhere along the line. He wanted to keep the risk to a minimum, and that meant having a good starting point, or better still, Vale being able to tell him a location within a short distance of the blade.
Will you help me?
Blue searched Vale's rich violet eyes as they swung his way and waited with bated breath. The darkness in them pushed, a black tide that surged from the edges of his irises towards his pupils, driving the purple back. He was playing with fire, and the part of him that would always hate Vale enjoyed seeing the male suffering. Having to battle the darkness, his vicious axe had awoken in him. Blue eased back in his chair, disgust at himself swift to rush through him on the heels of that feeling, and tried to look at Vale in a better light. The same golden shiny one that Lauren used to wash away the black shadows cast by Vale's sins. He wasn't surprised when it didn't work for him. Vale slowly nodded, and holy fuck, Blue actually witnessed a little glow of shiny light fall on the male. enough that he actually thought good of him for the first time in what felt like forever.
I'll help.
Rosalind tucked into the corner of the chaise longue, the leather creaking under her slender weight as she positioned herself near the armrest and patted her knee. Vale obediently swung his legs up and laid back, resting his head on her thighs and folding his arms across his stomach. His booted feet hung off the end of the seat, soles resting on the floor. At 6'6", an inch taller than Blue, his feet probably would have fallen off the end even if he'd had his head resting on the arm of the chaise longue. The male looked up at Rosalind, who gazed down at him, her blue eyes soft and filled with tenderness. She gently brushed the blue-black strands of her mate's hair from his forehead, the action seeming to soothe him as if she had the touch of nature herself. And for a flicker of time, a split second in which his guard fell, Blue envied the bastard. He quickly shut down that feeling and any associated with it, stopping them before they could surface and wreak havoc on him. He wasn't interested in a mate. He had a mission, a purpose, and he was going to fulfill it. Vale closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and sank against the seat, his entire body visibly relaxing into it.
Just focus,
Rosalind whispered, and continued to stroke his brow, his hair, and even tease the pointed tips of his ears. Blue wasn't sure how that was going to help him relax and focus. Just the thought of a female teasing his ears was enough to have his blood pounding and all rushing south. Vale didn't seem to have that problem as his mate fussed over him, speaking in a low, gentle voice, coaxing him into a sedated state. Was it magic she was weaving with her voice and touch? A form of a spell that went undetected by her mate? It seemed as if it was, as emotions flickered across Vale's face, turning it soft one moment and twisting it into darkness the next. Whenever it turned vicious, Rosalind soothed him and he relaxed again, sank deeper under her spell. Blue was beginning to feel sedated himself when Vale finally broke the silence, speaking in their native tongue.
"The Dragon Realm,"
he murmured, and then his voice grew louder and clearer, as if affected by his connection with the sword as it strengthened.
"Beyond its borders, I feel it, waiting, calling to me, screaming for me."
Vale's breathing deepened, and his hands twitched against his stomach, claws scraping over his armor. Rosalind's free hand came down on them, clasping them and stopping them before they could slice through the black scales. Elf armor was only weak against the same material. It was wise of Rosalind to stop her mate, not only because he could hurt himself, but because in the act of cutting himself with his own claws, he would spill blood, and tainted elves were deeply affected by the scent of blood. Blue didn't want to have to go back to Lauren and report that he had driven Vale into a fit of bloodlust. Lauren would probably see red himself on hearing it.
"It needs me,"
Vale whispered in a broken voice in English, and a tear slipped down his temple, soaking into his dark hair above his ear.
"Gods, it calls for me."
I know.
Rosalind brushed her thumb across the back of his hand, and his armor peeled away from it, leaving it bare for her to caress. She smiled and kept with her stroking, soothing her mate as best she could.
Where is it waiting, Vale?
His breaths came quicker and he shuddered. Her eyes widened as he raked his fingernails over his stomach and then his chest and struggled against her, his entire body lurching off the seat. She pressed her right hand against his forehead, pinning his head to her knees, and trapped his arms against his chest with her left. Strange words fell from her lips, a soft chanting that filled the air with the tinny scent of magic. The hairs on the back of Blue's neck stood on end, an odd sensation skittering over his skin beneath his armor. His every instinct warned him to remain where he was, even when a part of him wanted to aid her. Vale's eyes snapped open, edged down towards him, froze his backside in place on the seat. Black. They were as black as midnight.
Vale!
Rosalind snapped and slapped her mate across his right cheek. The darkness instantly evaporated, disappearing literally in a blink of the eye as Vale blinked and looked up at her, his violet gaze confused for a heartbeat, before he groaned and screwed his eyes shut.
It's okay.
she murmured softly and resumed petting him, her grip on him loosening as he relaxed again.
You just had a little moment. Nothing to worry about. Happens to us all.
Blue eyed her. It did? Rosalind was quirky, her mood flitting from serious to bubbly so quickly it sometimes left him dizzy, but he had never seen her having a moment. Did the witch have a dark side too? It would explain why she could love a male like Vale.
You don't have to go back in.
She smiled down at Vale as he opened his eyes and looked up at her again, weariness in his. He really did need to go back in. Blue needed to know where the sword was, and beyond the border of the dragon realm meant nothing. There were countless realms beyond its borders.
I am fine,
Vale gritted out, sounding for all the 3 realms as if he really wasn't. Stubbornness evidently ran in the family bloodline. How many times had Blue heard Lauren tell him that he was fine when he was falling apart? Vale closed his eyes again, heaved a sigh, and started to relax. Rosalind began murmuring the same soft, encouraging words she had used before, and again the sensation that they were magic ran through Blue. She was so small and slight, but she held such power over her brute of a mate. It was incredible. For 4,000 years, Blue had been convinced that Vale was a beast with no conscience, a monster made of flesh and bone, unable to feel anything or be tamed by anyone. But a tiny female had tamed him, had made him love and even live again. It all seemed so impossible. Was this the power of a bond? Was it magical enough that it could save even the blackest soul?
I feel it,
Vale whispered in the elf tongue.
Beyond the dragon realm.
Blue wanted to point out that he had already told him that, but held his tongue instead. He leaned forwards as the air thickened, the sense that Vale was forging a stronger connection with the sword through sheer will alone, running through him as he watched the male's expression shifting. Vale gritted his teeth and bared his fangs on a pained snarl, the black slashes of his eyebrows meeting hard as he grimaced. Rosalind shot Blue a black look that blamed him for her mate's suffering. Holy fuck, something was wrong with him, because he wanted to tell Vale to stop. He didn't want to see the poor bastard suffer anymore. He was on the verge of stopping Vale when the elf exhaled a string of words in a torrent that took Blue a moment to rewind and unravel.
It waits near the devil's domain, in a valley at the border of the dragons.
It was a start, but he needed better information than that. The border between the dragon and devil's realms was long and treacherous, and it could take months or years to scour it.
It is all I can give you from here.
Vale's deep voice filled the tense silence, and Rosalind stroked his chest and his hair. Blue looked at Vale, at the sweat dotting his brow, and listened to his ragged breathing as he twitched under Rosalind's tender touch, and didn't have the heart to ask him to try harder or mention the possibility of him traveling to hell with Blue's team, where he could get a clearer picture of the sword's location. Vale wasn't ready for that. He was struggling, hurting himself by helping him, and Blue actually felt sorry for him. He had never thought he would take pity on Vale, that his opinion of the elf could change for the better, but seeing him suffering in order to help another was enough to have him feeling that way. He also suddenly had the impression that keeping the peace with the Council of Elders wasn't the only reason Lauren hadn't been able to come to his brother, and had tasked Blue with the mission instead. In fact, he had the distinct impression that his prince had known that his feelings toward Vale would soften, his anger lessen, if he saw the male with his mate and saw how traumatized he still was by the things he had done, but that he was fighting to better himself and make amends. And gods help him, but Blue felt enough for the male to offer a few words that were both born of gratitude and a desire to help him on that path.
Lauren constantly thinks of you, and he is trying to get the council to allow you to return home.
Vale looked across at him, the black receding from his violet irises, and the corners of his lips quirked into a smile that wasn't forced this time. It was odd seeing Vale smile again, really smile, as he had so many millennia ago before everything between them had changed. Seeing it left Blue wondering something that he didn't like, because it made him cold inside. When was the last time he had really smiled? Not a forced one designed to placate others or because it had seemed the right response. Really smiled. He recalled laughing with Kiter and Iolanthe when he had been helping them a few months ago, and how it had warmed him, but it had felt so foreign to him, too. He wasn't sure he had smiled or laughed with meaning for millennia before that day, and he hadn't since. Iolanthe had told him once that he had been a changed male, one grim and somber since he had stopped talking of his dreams to her, of his one true desire. The one he had set aside in favor of serving his prince. The one he was beginning to yearn for again, despite all his protests and attempts to pretend otherwise, as he watched Vale with Rosalind, saw the love and devotion they shared in the life they lived together in the small cottage, the dream of finding his mate. Chapter 8. Taryn left her bleak quarters in the castle behind, obeying her urge to escape the confines of the room her brother had given to her. It was enormous, like all the rooms in the Black Citadel, but the walls had still closed in on her as she had paced, planning her next move. She hurried down the stone steps to the next level, fearing she would run into Tenak. She had left him hours ago in his large empty library, pawing over a crudely drawn map of the kingdoms of hell and muttering about his plans for them all. Being around him the past few days had been harder than she had expected. It had made her realize the depth of his madness, the hold the sickness that infested him had on him. He thought only of killing and subjugating, ruling all those he viewed as beneath him. Today, when he had started talking about her role in his righteous plan to bring hell to its knees before him, she'd had to make her excuses, stating that she was tired from her journey and needed rest. Tenak had turned concerned eyes on her, had touched her hand, and had bidden her a good sleep. Her hand still felt chilled from that touch. She rubbed it and quickly crossed the large entrance hall, heading towards the open arched door. Tenak never bothered to close it. That chilled her most of all, that certainty that he could slay any fool who dared to enter his home. He had been kind once, protective and fierce, but kind. He had flinched like any youth when dealing a blow in the training ring, had apologized countless times to those he hurt by accident or whenever he won a match. Now the cold eyes of a warrior looked back at her, tinged with madness, corrupted by a hunger for power. She doubted he would flinch if he had to fight the devil himself. He certainly wouldn't apologize. She broke out into the sloping area of smooth rock that she supposed was the courtyard of the castle. It had been carved deep into the mountain, with jagged sections left standing in a ring around it, natural walls at least 20 feet tall. There was no gate in the wall that enclosed the castle, no weak point. Any attacking forces without the ability to teleport or fly would have to use ladders to come over the walls or risk scaling the mountain to reach the rear of the castle. The lower section of the castle was heavily fortified too, with only narrow arrow slits for windows. She looked back at the arched doorway. If an enemy tried to enter that way, there was a thick steel portcullis ready to drop on them and seal the door. It was a grand castle, a perfect example of one. But she couldn't imagine who had built it. Here in the valley of the Dark Edge, so close to the Devil's domain. Had it been his men who had created the building that loomed above her, cragged towers reaching towards the dark gray sky? It suited her image of the male who had once ruled all of hell and still ruled half of it. He was dangerous and mysterious, little more than a myth or perhaps a legend. She only had stories to go on, and those stories had been told to her as a child 4,000 years ago. None had seen him in long millennia, or if they hadn't lived to tell the tale of the beautiful fallen angel who had given birth to this land and the demons who filled it. Taryn stared beyond the high mountains that formed the valley, her gaze on the amber-glowing sky to her left where the Devil's domain stood. She wanted to see it. As a child, she had been warned to stay away from the valleys close to the Devil's realm, for wandering baby dragons were the food of the beasts his kingdom contained. She had met a fallen angel once. He had tried to sell her at the black market, the one where she had crossed paths with the elf again. Her gaze grew hazy as she thought about that elf male. her senses instinctively reaching out across the land, drifting over it like smoke as she searched for him, part of her fearing she would sense him near, and the rest of her aching to find him there. Taryn whipped her focus away from the elf and pinned it back on the mountains. She wanted to see the Devil's Lands. Today she would scout that section of the valley. She closed her eyes and willed the shift, but forced it to come slowly, embracing the pain as her bones grew and distorted, broke apart to form new shapes beneath her skin. Scales rippled over her, and she used what magic she had to cast her leather trousers, boots, and corset away, bearing herself to the elements. The warm breeze caressed her naked skin a split second before the scales covered it, and she fell onto all fours as she allowed the shift to accelerate. She opened her eyes as her vision sharpened, and the ground dropped away from her as she grew, transforming swiftly into her dragon form. She threw her head back and roared as she beat her wings, the feel of them battering the air flooding her with joy she couldn't contain, not even when she still feared her brother would hear and follow her. Taryn spread her wings, stretching them wide, so the white membrane between her violet wing bones pulled taut. There was something deeply satisfying about stretching her wings in such a manner, feeling them from where they joined her shoulders to the very tips of the bones that intersected the membranes. She carefully placed her front paws down on the black wall, towering above it now, and beat her wings. Her back paws lifted off the ground and she stopped her wings, let her paws touch the ground again, and then sank low and kicked off, launching into the air. The valley fell away in an instant, becoming nothing more than a black streak before it blended into the rest of the lands, a blur of shadow, a sea of darkness. She beat her wings, holding herself suspended above hell, her sharp eyes picking out clusters of light in the swath of black. Whenever she focused on one, her vision zoomed in, revealing the village. She scanned each one in the dragon realm, something that was becoming habit, an urge that she found as difficult to deny as the need to fly. She pretended she wasn't looking for anything in particular, even when she knew in her heart that she was. The elf male. When her scan of the dragon realm was complete, she spread her wings and soared lower, letting the wind buffet her as she swept back down towards the valley. She twisted her body, lazily spiraling downwards, the black lands nothing more than a whirling blur that rushed past her eyes, punctuated by a brief flash of light. She flapped her wings to slow her descent and skirted the valley, denying the urge to fly higher again and look towards the source of that light, the Elf Kingdom. She had realized 2 days ago that she could see it when she flew high, able to pick out the golden light that filtered down on it, and part of the lands that surrounded it. It had been so green, filled with color and warmth, life. It had tainted her view of the rest of hell, painting it in a dull light that left it wanting. Even the dragon realm, her beloved home, now appeared black, cold, and grim to her. She turned her gaze towards it as she neared the end of the valley, looking back in the direction she had traveled to reach her brother, and then pulled her eyes away as she banked left. She followed the mountain ridge, heading towards the Devil's Domain, and started her work, charting all the escape routes she could take if necessary. Her tension faded as she flew, her mind occupied with small tasks, thoughts pulled away from the castle that often felt too cramped and her brother's plans. She focused on flying, feeling the warm air on her face and wings, flowing over her scales and curling around her tail. As she circled back around, passing the castle, she gazed down at it. A bolt of fear ran through her, scattering her calm. That fear had steadily been growing since her brother had taken her in, keeping her awake at night and setting her on edge around him. He hadn't mentioned the sword since she had said it was gone, but she knew he hadn't forgotten about it. It was his ultimate treasure, and that was the reason she had hidden it deep in the bowels of the castle, in a place far from the ones he frequented in his daily routine. Taryn breathed deep, her nostrils flaring as she took a massive gulp of air down into her lungs. She opened her jaws and exhaled. The taste of ashes coated her tongue. Her ancestors would have breathed fire, but all she could do was breathe ashes, her power diminished by the roof of hell that stole sunlight from her scales and magic from her bones. Her kind had been losing powers that were rightfully theirs since they had been cruelly banished from their home, cast into hell and cursed. It was just another cell, larger and grander than one she had occupied during the last 3 centuries, but a cell nonetheless. It held her, trapped her away from the light, stole her power from her and made her weak, leaving her at the mercy of others. Fire blazed through her blood, impotent flames that licked at her skin and wanted to burst from her, desperate to mix with the fetid air of hell and burn her grim cage to ashes. Taryn flew harder, needing to feel the air in her lungs and rushing over her scales. She needed to fly. Her wing bones ached, but she refused to slow. She couldn't. She had to keep flying. She had to be free. Had to fly. It was a compulsion, one she feared would drive her mad if she denied it. Pain burst along her entire left side and she barreled right, an agonized roar escaping her as she dropped through the air. Sharp claws pierced her scales, savagely raking over her ribs and back, close to tearing into her delicate white wing membranes. She turned wild eyes on her foe, her heart pounding hard and blood thundering as she instinctively lashed out with her barbed tail. It struck hard, on the shoulder of the violet and white dragon who was driving her down towards the mountains. Tenak. Taryn cried out again as she crashed into the ground at the base of the mountain, jagged rocks punching hard into her right side, and boulders and gravel spraying ahead of her as she slid across the uneven terrain. He rose above her when they came to a halt, his front paws on her hip and shoulder, pressing her down into the black ground. He bared huge, sharp teeth at her, his violet to white eyes wild and filled with fury that she could now sense in him. Anger at her. She hurled her head back and shrieked as he raked claws over her left flank, scoring long gashes in her scales. The pained sound echoed off the mountains, mocking her with its feebleness. Tenak snapped at her wings and neck with his jaws, and she tried to scramble away from him, kicking at him with her back legs. She caught him in the belly with her talons, and he snarled at her, his elliptical pupils narrowing into thin, deadly slits. The pounding of her heart grew frenzied as fear seized her, her eyes locking on his fangs as he launched at her again, aiming for the base of her left wing. He was going to kill her. Taryn kicked hard with both back paws, slamming them into his belly and knocking him back just as his jaws closed. His fangs clacked together bare inches from her wing bone, and he growled at her. She kicked again, frantic with a need to escape him. Only one thing could have caused him to turn on her. He had found the sword. He must have used her scent on the cloth, tracking it through the castle. As he reared back, looming above her, bloodlust shining in his narrowed eyes, she did the only thing she could to save herself. Taryn shifted back into her mortal form, her weaker form. Fear was clouding her judgment, and she had to see through it to the truth, trusting that he didn't want to kill her. He just wanted to punish her for taking what belonged to him, his greatest treasure, his prized possession. She had to trust that his dragon instincts and his instincts as her twin brother were still strong enough to prevent him from attacking her when she was weak and he could easily kill her. He remained staring down at her, cold, merciless eyes pinned on her as she huddled on her side, naked and trembling. Blood coated her, seeping from the gashes he had inflicted, the wounds burning even as the red liquid cooled her skin around them, catching the steady breeze that blew across the valley. Taryn prayed to the ancient gods and closed her eyes, bracing herself for his killing blow. May the gods have mercy on hell. She had failed everyone. Tenak would kill them all now he had the sword. The expected blow didn't come, and she managed to convince her lungs to work and her eyes to open. They did so slowly, fear still flowing through her. Poisonous whispered words that said he would strike her down the moment she set eyes on him. Tenak stood before her in his mortal form, dark purple leathers encasing his legs. His handsome face was dark as midnight, grim and forbidding, filled with the anger she could feel flowing from him and over her. His cold eyes held hers, sending a deeper tremor through her, one that racked her right down to her soul. She had looked into the eyes of hundreds of males, all of them wretched and dark in some way, foul and twisted. But she had never looked into their eyes and witnessed what she could see in Tenak's. He wanted to kill her. She had never feared those males, her masters, as she feared her own brother.
You had the sword,
Tenak growled and advanced on her. She shifted onto her bottom and scooted away from him, until her back hit a boulder and she had nowhere to run to escape his fury. He bared sharp teeth at her and his eyes flashed like fire.
You kept it from me. You lied to me.
Taryn shook her head, shifting her violet to white hair across her bare shoulders.
No, no, brother,
he snarled.
Liar! You deceived me. You stole the sword and you kept it from me. It is mine, sister. Mine.
I know,
she said, and he stilled, some of the tension leaving his muscular body as he eased back a step and eyed her, silently commanding her to continue.
I was bringing it back to you.
He didn't look as if he believed her. She had to convince him that she had been returning the sword to him, or her quest to free Hell of her brother's demented plans was going to end here, with her back against a rock, caged between it and him. Caged. She wrapped her arms around herself and fought that word. That feeling it awoke in her, sinking the sensation deep into her bones until she felt trapped in her own skin. The trembling worsened as she began to lose the fight, and she started to rock, stared at his knees and desperately tried to hold the pieces of herself together so she didn't fall apart. Not now. She needed to convince her brother to believe her. She couldn't slip into the madness. She fought it, but no matter how fiercely she pushed back against it, it was gaining ground, pulling her down into the darkness.
I am to believe you meant to return the sword.
Tenak hunkered down in front of her, his deep voice little more than a thick growl as he glared at her. His lips twisted in a vicious smile that faltered when he reached out to touch her and she flinched away. A frown flickered on his brow, a brief flare of anger in his eyes that she felt was directed at someone else and not her, at the males who had shattered her in a way, even when she had believed herself unbroken.
I escaped,
she whispered, not strong enough to put more force behind her words. They shook from her lips, trembled as fiercely as her body.
I spent months tracking the sword, and I stole it back. I was bringing it to you.
His face darkened again, and he curled his outstretched hand into a fist and drew it back to him. He unfurled it and pressed it against his bent knee, mirroring his other hand. The position caused his bare chest and arms to tense. A display of power, a tactic many male dragons employed where females were concerned. He was making sure that she knew he was stronger than she was, both in this form and his dragon one, silently keeping her in line and under his rule by eliminating any thought about attacking him.
If you were bringing it to me,
he murmured in a low voice that was so calm it set her on edge, screamed at her that he was close to lashing out at her again.
Why did you not give it to me that day I found you here in the valley?
Taryn swallowed hard and managed to force her eyes up to meet his.
Because you were angry with me, as you are now. I was afraid. I feared you would kill me. I fear you will—
I would never kill you,
he interjected, and brushed the backs of his fingers across her cheek. The next second his hand wrapped around her throat, and he snarled,
But if you are lying to me, I will butcher you.
Taryn's heart skipped several beats before slamming hard against her ribs, and she quickly shook her head. Her eyebrows furrowed as the fear that had already been flowing through her shot up to a level where it was hard to breathe, and almost impossible to find her voice to speak and convince him otherwise. His hand tightened around her throat, sending her careening beyond the reach of fear as fury rose up to overwhelm her. Cold steel, heavy, tight, choking her. She hissed at him, grasped his wrist and yanked it away from her throat, twisting it hard at the same time and tearing a pained yelp from him.
I was bringing the sword to you,
she snarled, the darkness in her voice shocking her, but not enough that she could escape the grip of it. She tightened her grip on Tenak's arm, digging her emerging talons into his flesh and spilling his blood. His eyes darkened, but they no longer frightened her. If he wanted to fight her, she would fight him back, and he would learn that she was no longer the meek little female he had always protected. She was a fierce dragoness.
I brought it to you because I need you to help me make them pay.
She bared her fangs and spat on the floor between them, aiming it at those who had caged her, who had somehow broken her despite her attempts to stop them.
I want to make them all pay.
Tenak's grimace became a dark smile that pleased her too much, promising her retribution, vengeance.
You are the only one who can help me,
she hissed and held his gaze, knowing that his only reflected the madness, the hunger for bloodshed and violence that filled hers.
You are strong, more powerful than I, and with the sword, you will be invincible.
Tenak grinned and rose onto his feet, easily shaking her grip. He held his hand out to her, his eyes filled with a bloody promise, one she wanted to accept even when she knew she shouldn't.
This valley is our kingdom now, but soon all of hell will cower at our feet.
Taryn placed her trembling hand into his and allowed him to pull her onto those feet he spoke of, and the image his words evoked terrified her, because she had made it possible. As she stared up into her brother's eyes, she could only feel one thing. She had made a terrible mistake, and all of hell was going to pay for it. Chapter 9. Blue sipped the dark bitter liquid, the cream mug warming his left hand, and stared at the bustling mortals. Their idle chatter blended into one stream of sound that filled the silence in his mind as he relaxed in a corner of the large, warmly lit room, surveying them and picking out the differences between each individual. He took another sip, enjoying the buzz that chased through his entire body each time the liquid hit his tongue. He had become accustomed to the brew the mortals called coffee, slowly introducing himself to it, aware that it held the same risks as alcohol. Too much too quickly and he would be hit with the full effects in a heartbeat, and the thought of bouncing around like a maniac jacked up on caffeine was not appealing. It also tended to make it hard to hold his mortal guise. His black apparel of t-shirt, jeans, and a long coat was only part of his disguise, and the easiest one to control since they were clothes he owned and had teleported to him before entering the establishment. The one he was in danger of losing control over was the more important part of his disguise, an elven trick that allowed him to blend into his environment by changing two key areas of his appearance, his eyes and his ears. Right now, his eyes were a more human shade of green, and the tips of his ears were rounded, but if he lost control, they would change back to violet and to pointed, and gods help him if he really lost control and his fangs descended. So, small sips were required, caffeine in moderation. He sank into the armchair, green gaze idly following a male, as he crossed the room to a group of waiting friends who greeted him with warm smiles and affectionate embraces. Losing interest, he switched his focus to another patron of the shop devoted to the dark brew, a younger male, one so awkward in his own skin that Blue wanted to shake his head and give the boy a few pointers in how to hold himself with confidence, commanding the respect of those around him. The teen shuffled from foot to foot in the queue, bright gaze leaping between his red scuffed shoes and the female serving behind the counter. A crush, perhaps? He had been young once, but he had certainly never been so unsure of himself, so embarrassed around females. What in the gods' names did mortal society do to young males, to turn them into such pathetic, limp creatures, afraid of their own shadow in the presence of a pretty female? He snorted and took another sip, diverted his attention elsewhere and settled it on a slightly older male, this one looking as if he had indulged in far too much feasting. His shorn hair was visibly receding as he removed a cap and then replaced it, neatening it as he moved through the occupied tables. The male stopped at one where a lonely female sat, and Blue canted his head. The female was pretty enough, not beautiful, but she had kind eyes and a warm smile for the male as she stood and embraced him. Blue huffed and shut them out as they began to kiss, no longer interested in watching them. He swirled his cooling coffee in his mug, his eyes on it, the gentle buzz in his veins quieting as his body purged the caffeine, and the silence in his mind dissipating, whispered thoughts surfacing as his focus turned inwards. He had come to this place to fill some time, but perhaps he had only thought that. Perhaps he had subconsciously had an ulterior motive for venturing to a place where mortals were known to pass idle time, thinking about things in their life or meeting with friends to talk. Perhaps he had come here to think too. That realization seemed to open the floodgates, filling his mind with too many thoughts, all of which clashed, crashing against each other until the comfortable silence he had been enjoying became a cacophony he could no longer ignore. The coffee cup shimmered out of focus, replaced by Lauren in the courtyard, looking at him in a way that had spoken to him, telling him something without his prince having to use words, answering the question Blue had done his best to ignore. Why had he left the Elf Kingdom a month ago? He could easily lie to himself, keeping the one he had been living rolling and pretending the truth was the lie instead. But he was tired, and everything over the past few days had mounted up on his shoulders, and they felt heavy now, pressing down on his heart. His prince was right. He had left because he had no longer had a purpose or a place where he felt he belonged. For 4,200 years, he'd had the purpose and that place, but now things were changing. No. Now everything had changed, and it felt as if it had happened in the blink of an eye. 42 centuries, most of his life, lived in the same way. A routine that had been ingrained so deeply in him that now it was gone, he wasn't sure what the hell he was doing anymore. His prince no longer needed him as a personal advisor, or to take care of him. He no longer had to attend to Lauren's morning ritual, entering his rooms at the castle before he woke to open the curtains and the double doors to allow light and air into the space. He no longer had to ensure Lauren had the blood he needed to heal whenever he was injured, or that he didn't overwork himself and had the rest he required to remain strong. He had been reduced to a glorified bodyguard, his primary responsibilities taken away from him. By Olivia, Lauren's mate and the kingdom's new princess. Olivia had replaced him, and Lauren no longer needed him. It was the same with Iolanthe, his sister. She had Kiter now, her mate who traveled with her on her adventures when she was hunting for an artifact, there to get her out of whatever trouble she landed herself in. It had been Blue's job once. For his entire life, since Iolanthe had been brought into it, he had watched over her, had protected her and taken care of her. Now she had another male to do that for her. His fingers tightened around the mug, threatening to shatter the delicate clay. He no longer had a purpose when once his purpose with those two people, the two he was closest to, had meant everything to him. Serving as Lauren's aide and commander and protecting his sister had been his life, and he had loved it. Blue closed his eyes, his eyebrows dipping low as he tried to shut out the noise of the coffee shop and the roar of his heart as it ached, throbbing madly behind his ribs. He rubbed the spot over it with his free hand, shifting the black t-shirt he wore. It was just the caffeine making it pound and hurt, nothing else. He set the coffee cup down and focused on something else, the dragon. His thoughts were quick to shift to her whenever he felt lost and adrift, uncertain. He mulled over everything he had learned in the last month, every shred of information, even the small tidbits that had seemed like nothing at first glance. He lost himself in his hunt instead, systematically shutting down the parts of him that were shaken by the changes in his life. Changes that were jarring and unsettling, difficult for him to process. Gods, he wasn't processing them at all. Lauren knew it. Blue had seen it in his eyes and knew what the male had wanted to say to him, what he would have said if they had been in private. He had responded to the upheaval in his life in the only way he knew, by distancing himself. Lauren had pointed it out countless times during their centuries together, always with a smile, a laugh in his voice even though he was deadly serious, as if he thought delivering it in such a manner would stop Blue from glaring at him. It never did. But he didn't know how else to react. He hadn't received the lessons that Lauren had during his upbringing, given training in handling delicate situations, often involving the feelings of others, ones that had enabled him to process his own emotions too. Blue had been trained as a soldier from his youth, taught how to respond to situations in a more tactical way, and that was exactly what he was doing now in order to protect his heart from taking more damage. He had withdrawn in order to regroup. He sipped the coffee and grimaced as the cold liquid hit his tongue, set the cup down and pushed it away from him, sliding it across the dark wooden surface of the round table. He kept his hand outstretched, fingers resting on the tabletop, his green eyes fixed on them, his mind wandering a course that was unfamiliar to him. One that had it connecting to the heart he had locked behind walls of elven metal so impenetrable he had thought it safe, when in reality it had been exposed all this time, allowing Lauren and Iolanthe to steal a piece of it and leave him bereft as they had left him behind. He growled under his breath and fought to push his thoughts onto a more stable path, one free of the tangled web of emotions slowly snaring him and pulling him deeper into his feelings. Rosalind flashed into his mind, a fleeting image of her looking down at Vale, her blue eyes filled with adoration and tenderness, and Vale gazing back up at her, the corners of his lips tilted into a satisfied and peaceful smile. Blue curled his fingers into fists, and the sound of wood creaking hurled him out of his memories and back to the present. He stared at his serrated claws where they were still pressed deep into the tabletop, and the long, ragged grooves he had cut into the wood with them without even realizing it. He hadn't issued a command to his armor. Hell, he hadn't even had it out under his mortal clothing of black jeans, boots, t-shirt, and long coat. It was out now, though, covering him from toe to neck, forming his claws. A response to the darkness that had surged through him on remembering how tender Rosalind had been with Vale. He drew down a deep breath and focused on his armor, willing it to return to the black and silver bands around his wrists. It obeyed, but not instantly, taking more than a second before it responded to the command. Not good. If he wasn't fully in control of his armor, it was because he wasn't fully in control of his emotions. His eyes widened. He swiftly raised his bare hands to his ears and grimaced as he found them pointed, their tips long and thankfully covered by his hair. He willed them to change, felt them become rounded again, and knew his eyes had switched to green too, concealing what he was. Holy fuck. The council would have him in the cells in a heartbeat if he exposed their kind to mortals. Perhaps thinking in a room filled with them hadn't been his wisest move after all. But it wasn't as if he had known his jealousy would darken his mood to the extent that he lost control over his emotions. Jealousy. Blue blew out a hard breath. Gods. Some fucked up part of him was jealous. It was envious of Olivia for being closest to Lauren now. It was resentful toward Kiter for taking his role as Iolanthe's protector. It was jealous of Vale for being able to find someone to love him, when Blue couldn't find someone who could love him. He almost laughed out loud when it hit him that Iolanthe would have been proud of him for actually working through his feelings and admitting the things he had, that Sable had wounded him, and seeing his friends and sister finding their mates, getting caught up in bonds and love, had tipped his world off balance. So he had run away, seeking solitude, space away from everyone who had hurt him and time to come to terms with everything that had happened. It was still too much. His life had been the same for 4 millennia, and now everything was different, and it felt as if it had happened in the blink of an eye to him. He couldn't deal with it. His focus immediately leaped back to the dragon, pulling her to the front of his mind. The riot in his head dulled, his emotions settling as he worked through everything he had uncovered about her. Only this time it struck him that there was a deeper reason he always thought of her whenever things became too much for him. She was the only constant, the one thing he could depend upon to be the same as before as his world crumbled around him. She was his anchor in this storm, and his reason for swimming forwards, pushing onwards when there was a part of him that wanted to stop and just let the waves crash over him and suck him down into the darkness. He felt eyes on him, but he didn't seek out their owner. Females had been studying him constantly from the moment he had entered the coffee shop, watching him closely. Many of them did it secretly, but others did it openly, boldly. They courted his attention, but only one female could hold it right now, had seized it in her talons with a grip so fierce he couldn't shake it. The dragon. His fingers idly caressed the scars on his neck, and he cursed under his breath in the elf tongue as they tingled in response. She could have cleaved his head off with the blow that had given him this permanent reminder of her. If he hadn't come to his senses and ducked to his right at the last second, she might have done just that. He had been a fool, underestimating her strength and how dangerous she was, but he had learned his lesson. This time, when they crossed paths, he would succeed. He caught the handle of his cup and brought it back to him. He turned it in his hand, tipped it towards him, stared down at his reflection on the surface of the black liquid. He would find her. It was only a matter of time now that he had assembled his team. When he returned to their stronghold, he would issue the order to head out. They would scour the dragon realm and not stop until the female was within his grasp. The sensation of eyes on him grew stronger and harder to ignore. He could understand their reasons for studying him. Elves had beauty and grace that attracted mortal eyes. He looked up through his lashes at the females dotted around the room, the ones whose eyes were on him. It would be easy to bed any one of them. Hell, he could bed more than one at a time and they wouldn't complain. Had done it plenty of times in the past. He leaned back and openly eyed them, gaining pretty blushes from some and bold smiles from others as he leisurely perused them. He could lose himself in any one of them for a short time. His green gaze settled on the blonde behind the counter, the one who had been giving him come-fuck-me smiles all night. He was tired of being alone. He needed some female company, even if it was only for a short time. Even if it couldn't be forever. Chapter 10. Blue shuddered as nails raked over his shoulders, clawed at his hair, and tugged on it. He groaned and kissed lower, trailing his lips over the flat of her stomach. Blood heated to 1,000 degrees as his mind raced forwards, towards his destination. The female moaned and wriggled, bucked up against him in a way that spoke of frustration, desperation. He would give her the release she craved soon enough. She just needed a little patience, because he needed a little time to get her to the point where that release would blow her mind. He licked her warm skin just above her hip, and she spread her thighs, inviting him lower. He growled in his throat and kissed downwards, open-mouthed wet ones that had her trembling beneath his touch, moaning with each brush of his lips across her flesh. She wriggled again, and he pulled back, silently admonishing her by withdrawing from her. She pouted, a pretty little one that had him aching to forget what he had been doing, rise over her and take her lower lip between his teeth to nibble on it. Blue raked his eyes over her bare body, traversing firm rounded breasts peaked with dusky nipples begging for his mouth, and the flat plane of her stomach, downwards to the place where he wanted to be. She brought her legs together, stealing it from view. He frowned at her, earning a wicked smile, and he held her gaze as he skimmed his hands up her thighs to her knees and edged them apart, forcing her to open to him again. Her little breathless moan almost did him in, and he groaned right back at her, his eyes dropping to the apex of her thighs. She glistened with arousal in the candlelight, making his mouth water and fangs itch, and his hard cock jump in anticipation. God, she would be warm and welcoming, tight around him. He dipped his left hand between her thighs and felt just how wet she was as she bucked against his fingers, rubbing herself along them. He took hold of his cock in his right hand, unable to deny the urge to fist it as he touched her, running his hand up and down its length as he kneeled between her legs and edged his fingers lower. Her eyes widened as he pressed one inside her, her body quivering as she tipped her head back and moaned, the low sound filled with pleasure that he could almost feel in her. He increased his grip on his length, matching how tight she was around his finger, and breathed hard, struggling to tamp down the surge of desire as he imagined being inside her. She rocked against him, riding his finger, and he withdrew it and released his cock before he made a fool of himself. Her glare chastised him, but it faded when he leaned over her, his eyes on hers, and lowered himself. Her gaze turned hooded as he swept his tongue over her aroused nub, flicking the pert bead with the tip, eliciting a gasp from her. One of her hands shot to the top of his head, fingers tangling in his hair, gripping tightly as the other clutched the pillow above her head. Her teeth sank into her lower lip, and her eyebrows furrowed as he laved her, long, slow strokes from core to nub, tasting every delicious inch of her. When her moans grew in volume, her body tense and flexing, seeking release, he slipped 2 fingers back inside her. Her heat scalded him, her moisture coating his fingers and allowing them to easily slide in and out. He groaned against her and lightly bit her pert nub, and couldn't stop himself from rubbing against the mattress to find some relief of his own. Fuck, he needed to be inside her hot little body, claiming her and spilling himself, feeling her quake around him as she climaxed. He needed to lose himself in her. He reared up and over her, caging her between his arms as he supported himself on his fists between her arms and her ribs. She gazed up at him, eyes hazy with desire, dark with need. He growled and kissed her, hard and deep, possessing her mouth in the way he wanted to possess her body. She moaned into his mouth and wrapped herself around him, pulling him down into contact with her. Her moist core pressed against his cock, and his eyes rolled back in his head as he groaned and barely stopped himself from rocking against her, dimly aware that if he did, it would be game over, and he wanted to find release inside her. The warmly lit room spun past him in a blur, and he sank into the mattress as she landed on top of him, her smile wicked and eyes hungry. He didn't resist her as she claimed his wrists and pinned them above his head, shoving them hard against the pillows and then pushing them higher. He obeyed as she made him hold the wooden bars of the headboard, clutching them and surrendering to her. She lowered her dark gaze to his lips and then his chest, and briefly dipped her body to press into his, caging his erection between them and scalding him with her wet heat. He closed his eyes and tipped his head back and rocked his hips, easily sliding between her thighs, tearing delicious moans from her. Her breath was hot on his right cheek as she kissed across it, teased him with a brief rush of her mouth across his, and continued down the other side of his face. He shuddered as she swept her lips down the line of his throat and kissed the scars on it, mouth following each long ridged line that darted from behind his ear to his collarbone. When she reached the end of the last mark, she kept moving lower, kissing across his chest. She raked fingernails over his pectorals, and he groaned as she caught his nipples, sending a spark of pain pleasure skittering across his skin. The moan became a growl as she moved lower, stealing her body away from his and leaving his cock exposed to the cooler air. He wanted to haul her back up to him, roll her over and plunge deep into her, but he forced his hands to remain where they were, locked around the headboard, and focused on her as she moved lower, her lips trailing fire across his abdomen. Anticipation swirled and built inside him, cranking him tighter. His cock kicked, balls tightening as they waited, eager for her attention. She held herself away from him, only her lips touching his skin together with the satin brush of her hair. Torture. He rolled his hips, every muscle flexing as he tried to reach her, and she clucked her tongue at him. Her hands caught his hips and she pinned them, holding him in place, tearing a groan from his lips that shocked him. Gods, he had never sounded so lost before, so desperate and wild, but he couldn't stop himself. He needed her, ached for her touch and for release. She had to feel that. She had to know what she was doing to him, driving him to the edge and over it. Blue ground his teeth and frowned as she breathed on his cock, bathing the sensitive head in moist heat. Too much. He shuddered and moaned and began to uncurl his hands. The first brush of her lips over the head of his length had them clamping so tight around the wooden poles that he heard them snap beneath his grip. He couldn't feel them give, though. He couldn't feel anything but the intense rush of pleasure that blasted through him as she kissed down his cock and licked back up it, flicking her tongue over the head before tonguing the slit, driving him so far over the edge that he was free-falling with no way of saving himself. It was game over when she wrapped her lips around him, taking him into her hot mouth, shattering his control. Everything blurred into one stream of pleasure, bliss so fierce that he lost himself entirely, becoming nothing more than sensation. He rolled his hips in time with her movements, driving back into her mouth as she sucked him. Gods, this was what he had needed, and he reveled in it, gave himself over to it and let it seize control of him, driving everything else out of his mind, losing himself in her. Her gaze was hot on him as her hand joined her mouth, stroking down as she took him back inside and up as she sucked, each one harder than the last. He swallowed and tried to convince his eyes to open, to seek her and watch her as she worked magic on his cock, but it was impossible as he spiraled higher, burned hotter. Her free hand cupped his balls, tugging and teasing, stroking and pushing him higher still, hotter still. He couldn't take it. He growled and tensed, every inch of him going taut as his lips peeled back off his teeth. His fangs punched long and his ears flared back, the pointed tips extending as fire and lightning rushed through him. His hips jerked up, thrusting his cock deep into her mouth as it pulsed, throbbing hard and shooting jets of his seed into her. She swallowed around him, caressed his shaft and his balls, teased him down as he fought for air, her touch gentle now as if she sensed she might break him. He was on the verge of shattering completely, numbed by his powerful release, blinded by pleasure that was more intense than anything he had experienced before. When his breathing slowed, his heart settling at last, and he had control over his body again, he slowly opened his eyes and looked down at the female. Soft, striking eyes met his, violet to white, the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. Gods, a male could lose himself in those eyes and never want to come back. Blue reached for her and brushed his fingers across her cheek. Her eyes darkened, lips parted, and his heart gave a hard kick as she took his thumb into her mouth and sucked it, holding his gaze. His cock stirred, hungry for more of the beautiful female who reacted so sweetly to him, passionate and ardent, fierce and possessive. A little bit wicked, his perfect match. Darkness encroached, snuffing out the candles, throwing her into shadow, and he frowned as it swallowed him. Blue breathed hard, trembling all over, flushed with heat as his heart pounded. He frowned, confused for a moment, and then groaned and screwed his eyes shut as he threw a mental command to the bedside lamp. He didn't want to look. He convinced his eyes to open. Shame swept through him as he stared down at his bare legs tangled in the dark blue sheets of the double bed, and his cock where it still pulsed against his stomach. And then he grimaced all over again when he spotted the warm liquid pooled in his navel and running down his right side. Fantastic. He bit out a sigh and sank into the bed, his body still trembling with the release running through it, turning his bones to rubber beneath his liquid muscles. Gods, he hadn't felt a release like that intense and powerful he wasn't sure how long. He didn't remember it ever feeling that good in reality, and it had only been a dream. How good would it feel in reality with her? Blue shoved that question away before he could supply an answer to it, scrubbed a hand over his face and shook his head. It was never going to happen. She was an enemy of his kingdom, his prince's. Holy fuck, his day had just gotten a lot worse if he was thinking about Vale as one of his princes again. He groaned. That groan only worsened as a soft knock sounded on the door of his room, and a familiar female voice traveled through it.
"Are you well, brother?"
Iolanthe said.
"You were screaming, or something like it."
A blush blazed up his cheeks. Yes, his day had just gotten so much worse. The last thing he needed was his little sister hearing him climax from a damned dream. He shouldn't have stopped to rest at Underworld, the nightclub in London owned by her mate. He should have gone straight back to the stronghold. "I was having a nightmare," Blue snapped, because it seemed true the more he looked at it. Dreaming of the female dragon was a fucking nightmare. His whole life felt like one right now. He recalled the coffee shop and how he had been on the brink of flirting his way between the pretty blonde's thighs, when the damned dragon had hijacked his mind and his body, and any enthusiasm he had felt for the mortal had deflated. Suddenly, every female in the cafe had looked unappealing, and all he had been able to think about was the beautiful female who had haunted him for centuries. The bedroom door opened a crack, and Blue teleported in an instant, appearing before it and slamming the flat of his palm against it, forcing it shut. Iolanthe squeaked. I'm naked. A reasonable excuse since he was naked, and the evidence of his depraved hunger for the female dragon was now running down his thigh. He growled. Give me a minute. I need a shower.
I will wait in the break room. Come along when you feel ready to talk, Blue.
She moved away, but he remained standing at the door, his hand pressed against it and not to keep it shut any more. It trembled as it supported his weight. Talk. Blue cursed his little sister for being so damned astute, so attuned to him. He didn't do talking, and she knew that, so he wasn't sure why she thought he would this time, or why he ended up taking a quick shower, throwing his jeans and t-shirt on and padding barefoot down the narrow corridor to the break room. To talk. Chapter 11. Iolanthe looked up as Blue entered the break room of the nightclub, a basic kitchen tucked into the corner of the room behind her. Her long black hair spilled around her shoulders, blending into her dark satin robe, and her violet eyes greeted him with a tender warmth that only served to pull a sigh from his lips. Her slender fingers toyed with a red mug filled with coffee, and there was another cup on the round white plastic tabletop opposite her. He shoved his damp hair out of his face and slumped into the chair in front of the mug she had evidently poured for him. He lifted the hideously decorated white cup to his lips, ignoring the sprightly unicorn on it. She had chosen it on purpose, secretly amusing herself with how he would react to being given such a childish feminine drinking vessel. He wasn't going to give her the pleasure of seeing the reaction she had envisioned. He wasn't in the mood.
What is wrong, brother?
Iolanthe set her red mug down, and her face filled with tenderness and concern that warmed him, lifting his mood and chasing away the black storm clouds, leaving him on the verge of sighing into his coffee like some damned female, as he contemplated an answer to her question.
When you came to us tonight looking for a place to rest, you did not look tired. You looked weary. Something is troubling you.
It was, and there was little point in denying it. Iolanthe had been born stubborn, a determined little thing from the moment she had been brought into his world like a ray of purest sunshine, a gift from the gods themselves. She had quickly learned to bend him to her will and the ways of getting whatever she wanted from him, and he had always had difficulty denying her. I am hunting the dragon again, he said, and the look she gave him warned that he wasn't giving her what she wanted. He was giving her excuses. She folded her arms across her chest. He sighed into his coffee and couldn't believe he was about to do this. He was going to talk to her. Hell, his world had already changed beyond recognition. He might as well keep rolling with it and change some other things too. Or roll them back to how they had been centuries ago, when he had shared everything with Iolanthe, before he had closed himself off. He needed to do that now, getting it all off his chest, or he would probably go mad.
Why were you in the mortal realm?
She said before he could speak, and he knew she wasn't going to like the answer. I came to see Vale about tracking the sword. He frowned at the table. Fury was there. He didn't need to look at his sister to see the black scowl she was giving him, or reach with his senses to detect the anger that rose in her. It wasn't anger towards him. She was angry about what Vale and Fury had done to him, and had been all her life.
If I ever see that male again, I will not be held responsible for my actions,
she bit out, and he almost smiled. Fury had always borne the brunt of her anger, and part of Blue cherished how fiercely she reacted whenever his name was mentioned, turning into a vicious little thing on his behalf, filled with a hunger to act out some sort of vengeance on the elf male. Her violet eyes landed on him, and he looked up at her, his amusement falling away as their gazes locked and she stripped away the barriers around his feelings. He cursed her in the way she had always been able to do that, tearing down his carefully constructed defenses. He had tried so hard to hold her at a distance as he did with others, not allowing her to see how deeply things affected him.
You have that look again,
she whispered with a knowing half-smile.
You hate it, but we are siblings bound by blood.
He huffed. I do not hate it. Iolanthe leaned forwards, reaching across the white plastic tabletop to place her hand over his. She squeezed it, and he looked down at their joined hands and then up into her eyes. They were soft and warm, filled with affection.
You always were easy for me to read, but perhaps that is only because you showed yourself to me. Before you shut that mail away behind a wall of false smiles and easy laughter that never reached your eyes. I know you, Blue. I know you because I know me. We are cut from the same cloth.
He wanted to look away from her, to bring up that barrier she spoke of, but he didn't have the strength. Her smile turned sympathetic.
You are passionate, emotional, and though you try not to be, you are. You love deeply, and that only makes you easier to wound without people realizing it, especially when you refuse to show those feelings. You ache for your fated one, and so you foolishly fall for any female who bestows smiles and affection on you.
He pulled his hand away from hers and glared into her eyes. She didn't repent. With a smile, she said,
Do not pretend you do not want your Kiara.
He never had, and he saw little point in attempting such a farce with his sister, since she had been the one he had subjected to his ridiculous prattling about finding his mate all those centuries ago. A sigh escaped her, and she leaned back.
I wish people did not hurt you. I wish Vale had not darkened your heart, and fury not slammed the barriers around it shut.
Blue set his jaw and kept glaring at her. Suddenly, talking didn't sound so appealing. Not when she was determined to drag his heart through the darkest reaches of hell. He stared into her eyes, silently challenging her to dare to say more on the subject. He knew his past. He knew the pain Vale and Fury had caused, the scars he still bore inside. He could never forgive them for what they had done to him, and he could never forgive himself for allowing such a weakness to gain a hold inside him. He had been weak, young and foolish. He had admired and respected Fury. He had admired and respected Vale, too. He had damn near adored them. The adoration, the devotion, had only gotten him wounded. The story of his fucking life. Iolanthe's knowing sigh grated on his last nerve, and he bared his fangs at her. She scowled at him.
Do not blame me for the actions of others.
Why not? Hadn't she hurt him too? Hadn't Lauren and Sable? She talked of him holding himself at a distance and closing himself off in order to avoid being wounded. But such tactics didn't work. The evidence of that was right in front of him. He had built walls around his heart, determined to never allow anyone into it again. He had refused to feel deeply for anyone, so he wouldn't be hurt again. He had fought to purge that weakness and never allow it to infest him. He had decided to be strong, invulnerable. Yet Iolanthe and Lauren had somehow breached that barrier, and even Sable had broken it. Gods, was there no way to protect himself?
Speak to me, Blue,
Iolanthe whispered, and he realized he had stopped again. He had withdrawn into himself, something that was habit now, difficult to break even when he wanted to talk with his sister in the way he had long ago, telling her everything that was on his mind and in his heart. She moved to the seat on his left, placed her hand over his on the table and stared at it, her expression shifting towards somberness.
You are not alone.
She kept her gaze on their hands, but he felt as if she had pierced his soul with the awareness in those 4 words, had looked right down into it and had seen the truth he tried so hard to hide.
You are not unloved. I am sorry that she hurt you, that I hurt you.
She lifted her bright violet gaze to his.
One day you will hurt me back. One day you will find that Kiara you dreamed of, and she will steal every drop of your love.
Blue couldn't ignore that, or the ripple of hurt that went through his sister. He turned his hand beneath hers and clasped it as he looked deep into her eyes. Ridiculous. I will always love you. Forever, Iolanthe. No one can take my love away from you. He wasn't sure anyone even wanted to try, that he would ever find his fated one. But he was sure that if he found his mate, his love for her wouldn't diminish his love for Iolanthe. She toyed with his fingers, her eyes on them, and smiled mischievously.
Since you know that in your heart, and our hearts were created the same, You must also know that mine is as constant in its affection as yours.
She slid him a sideways glance.
Do you not?
Blue nodded and then frowned as he realized she had tricked him into admitting that he did know that, had made him realize that he knew it to the very depth of his soul.
My love for Kaita does not take any of my love away from you.
She swept her fingers across his cheek and frowned back at him.
I am sorry it has troubled you, though. I never wished to hurt you, although I do seem good at it.
He managed to smile at her attempt to lighten the mood.
I have lost count of the number of bones I have broken because of you, or the number of assassins and mercenaries who count me among the list of foes they wish dead the most.
She shrugged and smiled, an innocent little one that might still work on her mate when she got herself into trouble and needed help, but had long ago lost its effect on him.
So what was your nightmare about?
That question hit him hard in the gut, and he could only stare at her as he considered his answer. As seconds ticked past, her gaze grew more curious, venturing deeper into his eyes as if she could find the answer there.
It was just a nightmare.
He hadn't told her details about his dreams in the past, and there was no damned way he was going to start now.
Do you often have nightmares about the dragon?
His breath left him in a rush, and his eyes darted between hers, and he might as well have just tossed all his cards onto the table, because her little smile was victorious. Damn, she had played him again, and he had fallen right into her trap. He had to be more careful around her. She was clever, used to winkling information out of people who didn't want to talk, a trick that was useful in her line of work. His eyebrows knit in a tight frown, and she huffed.
Do not give me that look. It was not difficult to put 2 and 2 together to come up with 4, brother. You came here looking weary, and you spoke of hunting the dragon again. I know that it plays on your mind now as it did in the past, and it was easy to guess that the dragon was the focus of your nightmare.
She always had been able to see right through him, and perhaps talking a little about his mission would prove helpful. Iolanthe had traveled across hell during her adventures, into areas most didn't dare traverse, including lands bordering the devil's domain. There was a chance she would be able to give him information that could lead to him finding the dragon. But he had to be careful, gathering the cards he had scattered in front of her and holding them close to his chest this time, because if he talked too much about the female dragon, his sister would probably see through him again. He needed to keep her thinking this conversation was all business, that the dragon was just a mission to him. He paused. Was she something more? He really wasn't sure, and he was too tired, too fresh from the dream to consider an honest answer to that question.
The dragon surfaced again a few months ago, and since I had free time, I decided to track it across hell and see if I could uncover where it had gone.
He leaned back in the chair, and Iolanthe rose from hers, took their 2 coffee mugs, and walked to the opposite side of the room, to the kitchen there. She lifted the jug from the machine, refilled their mugs, and brought them back to him. He looked down into his as she set it on the white table in front of him, and took the seat across from him, gaze growing unfocused as he stared at the dark surface.
When I returned to Prince Lauren, he tasked me with hunting the dragon, and allowed me to pull together my old team.
Iolanthe laughed.
And is Leif still in love with Prince Lauren?
Blue smiled, couldn't really contain it as he caught the mischief shining in his sister's eyes, and the way her lips curved said that she liked seeing him smile again. It fell from his face as he considered how much he had changed from the male she had grown up with, and faced the truth she had put out there, that he forced smiles and laughter when the situation called for it. He hadn't really had much to smile or laugh about in the last few millennia. It felt as if he had slowly forgotten how to do such things, each false smile or laugh stealing more of his ability to allow real ones out.
I believe Leif still holds a deep affection for our prince.
Blue couldn't hold that against the male, though, because he had behaved in such a way once, desperately emulating a male he wanted to be more than anything in the world in the ridiculous hope that male would notice him. The difference was, he had been a youth at the time and Leif was a grown male.
You hold one too,
Iolanthe said. and he frowned before he realized that she wasn't talking about his feelings for Vale, ones that male had murdered together with most of his legion that night 42 centuries ago. She was talking about his affection for Lauren.
It is nice you have friends.
Blue waved her away and sipped his coffee. Not hiding in it, he just needed the caffeine. His sudden thirst and interest in the drink had nothing to do with avoiding Iolanthe's knowing gaze.
Ah, you are upset with Prince Lauren, too.
He scowled over the rim of his stupid unicorn mug at her. Her victorious smile pulled a sharp huff from him. Played again. Fuck. He needed to stop falling into her traps. Hadn't he sworn to keep his cards closer to his chest? Yet here he was, tossing them all down in front of her again. Iolanthe clasped her mug in both hands and held his gaze.
You will find your mate one day, Blue, when you least expect it. You told me that only I could love you forever, that everyone only loved you for now or not at all.
He was tempted to look away, but he was damned if he was going to let himself go through with such a weak move. Even when looking into his sister's eyes only made him feel the depth of what she was saying, and it scoured his insides, hollowing his chest out and leaving it cold. He had told her those things when she had been on the verge of mating with Kiter, when his guard had been broken by Sable and his heart left exposed and vulnerable. He should have known she would remember them. She released her mug and reached across the table, holding her hand out to him. He just stared at it and she sighed, a soft one that conveyed a wealth of hurt.
You are wrong, Blue,
she whispered, her violet eyes round and filled with warmth as they held his.
The truth is, you will find your mate, and you will finally have the one female you have been waiting for, and she will be worth that wait.
He hated to admit it, but it felt good to hear that. It hit him with the force of a hell beast in a raging charge, but was as comforting as an angel's embrace. He shook his head. I am beginning to see why people dump their problems on others. Iolanthe's laugh filled the room, a soft melody that almost made him smile again.
It's called sharing a burden and feelings, and you used to do it all the time.
Her smile fell, sucking the light from the room, and she looked down at her coffee. Before I lost myself in the war with Vale, he said it for her, and she lifted her eyes back to his, an apology shining in them. I lost hope. But the war and protecting Lauren became my life, and my purpose, and I was fine with that.
Was fine?
She frowned at him.
Past tense?
Am fine, he corrected, but she already looked as if she didn't believe him.
You were not fine, brother. You merely thought you were. You gave up on something that had meant the world to you.
He shrugged that off. I'm fine with it now. The look she gave him called him a liar. So it wasn't the truth, and there was little point in trying to pretend that it was, since he had just spilled the bloody contents of his heart to her. It was ridiculous of him to attempt to deny that he wanted to find the mate he dreamed of now more than ever, when she had pieced together how seeing everyone important in his life happily mated made him feel. But it was habit, and it was old, and those ones were the worst to break.
Will you answer a question honestly for me, Blue?
He didn't like the sound of that, but he nodded, curious about what she wanted to know, even when he feared that it would hurt him.
Actually, do not answer it, but think about it, as I have thought about it.
That sounded even more ominous to him, and he leaned back in his chair again, not sure he liked where this was going at all.
Were your feelings for the huntress real, or a product of your circumstances at the time?
She toyed with her mug again as he tried to process what she was saying, his ears ringing as if she had just smacked him around the head with a mace, brain fuzzy as thoughts collided in it, unleashed by what had been such an innocent-sounding question. Her lips moved, and he had to focus hard to hear what she was saying above the riot in his skull.
I saw at the time she had wounded you, and I believed you had loved her with all of your heart. But looking back now, knowing your feelings about seeing myself and Prince Lauren find our mates, I am no longer sure.
Holy fuck. He wasn't either. He had wanted Sable, and that want had clouded his vision and his heart. But leaving the elf kingdom behind and focusing everything on pursuing the dragon female had cleared that vision, and Iolanthe had just pierced the veil of shadows over his heart, allowing light to stream into it again. That light washed over memories he had buried deep, feelings long forgotten, and he couldn't get enough air into his lungs as everything he had somehow suppressed came rushing back to the surface, leaving him reeling. Gods. He slumped into the chair, staring at his sister but not seeing her, as it all fell into place and he felt like a fool. Because of what had been happening at the time he had met Sable, he had somehow tangled together his pent-up desire with the loneliness he had felt on seeing Lauren wrapped up in Olivia, falling in love with her and torn yet excited about the prospect of having a mate. The result had been him believing that he felt something more than mere lust for Sable, when all along it had been impossible, because he had already met his fated female.